The silver tray shook in Evan's hands, not from weight, but from the cold that had seeped through the service elevator's metal walls and into his bones. During the 30-second ride from the basement kitchen to the 6th floor of the Drake Hotel, outside, Chicago's late winter wind howled off Lake Michigan with a fury that made the ancient building groan. A sound so familiar to Evan after 3 years of working nights that he barely registered it anymore. But tonight, something felt different. The air on the 6th floor carried an electric stillness, the kind that settled before lightning struck. And as Evan stepped into the carpeted hallway with its gold-veined wallpaper and brass sconces, casting amber pools of light every 10 feet, his breath came shallow and quick, fogging slightly in the over-air-conditioned corridor. The order ticket clipped to his apron pocket read Room 607, 2 club sandwiches, fries, bottle of Chardonnay, extra napkins. Simple enough. But Evan's mind was elsewhere, caught in the fragments of a conversation he'd overheard in the staff break room an hour earlier. Dina, the night receptionist, whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose voice carried the weight of 15 years behind the Drake's front desk, had been speaking in hushed tones to Miguel, the senior bellhop. Evan had only caught pieces, something about a guest in the tower suites who'd been paying cash for rooms for years, always under different names, always requesting the same discreet services. "Nobody asks questions," Dina had said, her words edged with something between resignation and unease. "Not when the tips are that good." Evan balanced the tray on his left hand, a skill that had taken him months to perfect when he'd first started at 23. Fresh off a Greyhound from Peoria, with nothing but a duffel bag and a hollowed-out space where Hope used to live, and used his right to fish the master key card from his vest pocket. His fingers, chapped from Chicago's brutal winter and from washing dishes before his promotion to room service, fumbled with the plastic card as he approached the door marked with brass numbers that gleamed under the hallway's soft lighting, or so he thought. Evan's eyes burned from exhaustion. He'd been on shift since 10 p.m., and it was now pushing 2:37 a.m., according to the ancient Timex on his wrist, a gift from his late father that had stopped working twice, but that Evan refused to replace because it was the only thing he had left that smelled faintly of Old Spice and motor oil and Sunday mornings. His vision blurred at the edges as he squinted at the numbers, his brain automatically translating the shapes into what he expected to see rather than what was actually there. The 7 looked enough like a 6 in the dim light, and the 0 was a 0, and the 6, well, his exhausted mind simply didn't register the difference. He swiped the card. The electronic lock clicked, a sound that always reminded Evan of a small bone snapping, and the light flashed green. He pushed the heavy door open with his shoulder, already forming the professional smile he'd practiced in the bathroom mirror during his first week, the one that said, "I'm here to serve you, and your comfort is my only concern," even though the truth was that Evan's own comfort had been shattered 2 years ago when his younger sister, Mia, had died in a car accident on I-90 during a snowstorm, and he'd been the one to identify her body because there was no one else, their mother having passed from cancer 3 years before that, and their father long gone to cirrhosis and regret. "Room service," Evan announced, his voice automatically adopting the gentle, deferential tone that management insisted upon. "I have your—" The words died in his throat. The scene before him wasn't what he'd expected, a guest sitting by the window or lounging on the bed, perhaps on a business call or watching late-night television. Instead, his eyes locked onto a woman sprawled on the floor near the foot of the king-sized bed, her body twisted at an angle that suggested she'd either fallen or collapsed, or simply given up the strength to stand. She was wearing what had once been an elegant black dress, silk or satin. Evan couldn't tell from the doorway, but the fabric was torn along the right shoulder, exposing pale skin marked with red scratches that looked fresh, angry. Her dark blonde hair, probably styled carefully hours earlier, now hung in tangled ropes across her face. Some strands stuck to her cheeks, with tears and what might have been makeup running in grey-black streams. She wasn't moving. Evan's heart seized in his chest, a physical sensation like someone had reached through his ribs and squeezed. For one terrible, endless second, he thought she was dead, and his mind catapulted back to Mia's hospital room, to the machines that had gone silent, to the sound of his own breathing being the only living thing in that sterile space. But then he saw it, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of the woman's back, the way her fingers twitched slightly against the carpet's floral pattern, and the sound, God, the sound that came from her was something Evan would remember for the rest of his life. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a wail or a scream. It was a silent crying, the kind where the throat is so constricted by grief that no sound can escape, where the body shakes with sobs that have no voice, where every breath is a struggle against drowning in invisible water. The tray nearly slipped from Evan's hand. He caught it at the last second, the bottle of Chardonnay clinking against the glasses, and he stood frozen in the doorway, his brain scrambling to process what he was seeing, to formulate a response, to remember his training. Was this a medical emergency? Should he call 911? Was she injured or drunk and then she looked up. Her face, and Evan would later try to describe this to Dina, to Miguel, to anyone who would listen, but words always failed him. Her face was a map of devastation. She appeared to be around 40, with fine lines around her eyes that suggested a life of smiling, though there was no trace of a smile now. Her eyes, green or hazel in the room's dim light, were swollen nearly shut from crying, and they held an expression that Evan recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror on the worst nights after Mia's death. The look of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been ripped away, leaving nothing but a void where certainty used to be. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice so hoarse it sounded like sandpaper on wood. "I'm sorry, I thought I locked." Her words dissolved into another silent sob, her shoulders curling inward as if she could fold herself small enough to disappear. Evan's training, the employee handbook he'd studied, the protocols for dealing with distressed guests, all of it evaporated. What remained was instinct, and perhaps something deeper, the recognition of pain in another human being, the kind of pain that transcends hotel policies and professional boundaries and social norms. He'd been taught to maintain distance, to call management, to never enter a guest's personal space uninvited. But looking at this woman on the floor, at the way her body shook with the effort of breathing, at the absolute aloneness that radiated from her like cold from ice, Evan made a choice. He stepped fully into the room and let the door close behind him. "Ma'am," he said softly, setting the tray down on the dresser near the door with trembling hands. "Are you hurt? Do you need a doctor?" She shook her head violently, her hair whipping across her face. No doctors. No one, please." The desperation in her voice was palpable, a living thing that filled the space between them. I can't." She pressed her palms against her face, as if she could physically hold herself together, and her breathing came faster, sharper, tipping toward hyperventilation. Evan knelt slowly, keeping several feet between them, making himself smaller, less threatening. Through the tall windows behind her, he could see the lights of Chicago's Gold Coast glittering against the black lake beyond, could see the occasional car moving along Lakeshore Drive like a lonely firefly. The wind rattled the glass, making the heavy curtains sway slightly despite being partially drawn. "Okay," Evan said, his voice steady in a way that surprised him. "Okay, no doctors. That's fine. But I can't leave you like this, ma'am. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound patronizing or invasive. "You're on the floor, and you're crying, and something bad has clearly happened. My name is Evan. I work here. I'm not going to hurt you, or call anyone you don't want me to call, but I need to know if you're physically hurt. Can you tell me that much? If you've ever found yourself in a situation where everything you believed was true suddenly shattered, where the person you trusted most revealed themselves to be a stranger, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. It helps us share real stories of struggle and survival with others who need to know they're not alone." Now, back to this unfolding moment. She lowered her hands slowly, revealing eyes that looked at him with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been gratitude. For a long moment she just stared, as if trying to determine whether he was real or some hallucination conjured by her distress. Finally she nodded, a tiny movement. "Not hurt, not like that. I'm not physically hurt, but something happened," Evan said gently. It wasn't a question. A bitter laugh escaped her lips, a sound so broken it made Evan's chest ache. "Something happened," she repeated, as if tasting the words and finding them grotesquely insufficient. "Yes, you could say that. You could say that everything I thought was real for the last 12 years just turned out to be a lie, and I'm sitting on the floor of a hotel room because my husband—" Her voice cracked like thin ice, and she had to stop, had to breathe, had to steady herself before continuing. "My husband just walked out that door and told me that our entire marriage, our entire life, was built on someone else's secret. Someone I thought was dead." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Evan couldn't yet fully grasp. Outside, an ambulance siren wailed in the distance, growing louder and then fading away, and Evan found himself thinking about all the emergencies happening simultaneously in this city of 3 million people, all the private catastrophes unfolding behind closed doors, all the moments when a person's life pivots on a single revelation. "I'm Laura," she said suddenly, as if just remembering that names mattered, that identity mattered, even when everything else was falling apart. "Laura Westfield, and I know I must look ... She gestured vaguely at herself, at her torn dress and smeared makeup, and the absolute wreckage of her appearance. "I know this looks bad. It probably looks like I'm having some kind of breakdown. It looks like you're having a really terrible night," Evan said, and the honesty of it, the simple acknowledgement, without judgment, seemed to release something in Laura. Her face crumpled again, but this time when she cried, there was sound, a low, keening wail that came from someplace deep and primal, the sound of grief that has no words, no shape, no containment. Evan stayed where he was, kneeling on the carpet that smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and old perfume, and he let her cry. He'd learned, after Mia's death, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone in pain is simply presence, simply staying, simply not running away from their anguish because it makes you uncomfortable. So he stayed, and he waited, and he watched the wind batter the windows, while Laura Westfield's life shattered into pieces. On the floor of room 706, when the worst of the crying subsided, leaving Laura gasping and shaking, but quieter, Evan spoke again. "Mrs. Westfield, Laurie, I think you might be more comfortable on the bed or in one of the chairs. Can I help you up?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed to see him clearly for the first time. "Why are you still here?" she asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. "Your room service. You brought—" She glanced around, confused. "Wait, I didn't order anything." Evan felt his stomach drop as realization crashed over him. He looked at the room number embossed on the leather folio on the desk, 706. His eyes shot to the door, to the brass numbers he'd misread, and a flush of heat crawled up his neck. "Oh God," he breathed. I'm in the wrong room. This is 706. I was supposed to go to 607. I'm so sorry. I didn't. The numbers, I misread them, and the card worked. And you made a mistake, Laura said, and there was something almost like wonder in her voice, as if the concept of mistakes, of random chance, of accidental interventions, was a revelation. You opened the wrong door. I am so sorry, Evan repeated, already starting to stand, already preparing to back out of the room and pretend this never happened, to take his tray and his embarrassment and his violation of God knows how many hotel policies and just disappear. I'll go right now. Don't, Laura said sharply, and the words stopped Evan cold. Please don't go. Not yet. Their eyes met across the dim room, and Evan saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. Naked, desperate fear of being alone. It was a look he knew intimately, had felt on his own face in the months after losing everyone who mattered, when the silence of his studio apartment on the south side became so oppressive that he'd sometimes walk the streets at 3 a.m. just to hear other people's voices, even if they were strangers arguing or laughing outside bars he couldn't afford to enter. I won't go, Evan said quietly. Not if you don't want me to. Laura closed her eyes and exhaled a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you. She accepted his offered hand, and Evan pulled her gently to her feet, noting how light she felt, how her legs wobbled as she stood, how she gripped his arm for a moment to steady herself before releasing him and taking a step back, wrapping her arms around herself as if to hold in warmth that had long since fled. Now that they were both standing, Evan could see the full extent of what had transpired in this room. The king-sized bed was rumpled, the expensive white duvet pulled askew, and one pillow on the floor. On the nightstand, a champagne bottle sat empty in its bucket, the ice, long since melted into lukewarm water. 2 glasses, one lipstick-stained and one not, stood beside it. A man's wallet lay open on the dresser, and Evan caught sight of credit cards and cash carelessly spilled beside it, as if someone had left in a hurry. Near the window, a small rolling suitcase sat upright, and scattered around it were items of women's clothing, a cashmere sweater, a pair of designer jeans, intimate items that made Evan look away out of respect for Laura's privacy. He left all my things, Laura said, following Evan's gaze. Her voice had gone flat, emotionless, as if she'd reached the limit of what her body could process. We were supposed to be here for the weekend, an anniversary trip. 12 years married, 15 years together. He booked this place specifically, the Drake, because this is where we had our first date. Room service in his apartment, but he'd stolen the menus from this hotel and pretended we were here. Romantic, right? The word romantic came out twisted, poised. Except tonight, he told me the truth. All of it. And then he just left. Evan wanted to ask what truth, what revelation could shatter someone so completely, but he held his tongue. Sometimes people needed to tell their story at their own pace. And something in Laura's posture, the way she'd turned toward the window, staring out at the city lights as if they held answers, suggested that the words were coming, that the dam was about to break. Do you believe in knowing people? Laura asked suddenly, her breath fogging the cold glass. Really knowing them? I thought I did. I thought Joel, my husband, Joel Westfield, I thought I knew every part of him. His favorite breakfast, the way he hums Beatles songs in the shower, how he folds his socks in perfect little squares, how he can't sleep unless he's touching some part of me, even just his foot against my leg. I thought I knew his parents' names, his childhood stories, his first love, his fears, his dreams, all of it. She pressed her forehead against the window, leaving a small circle of condensation, but I didn't know anything. Not really. The man I married, the man whose children I wanted to have, we were trying. We've been trying for 2 years. That man doesn't exist. He never did. Evan moved slowly to the small sitting area in the corner of the room, where 2 upholstered chairs faced each other across a low table. He sank into one, his legs suddenly unreliable, and waited. The silence stretched, broken only by the wind and the distant sounds of the hotel pipes settling, someone's television murmuring through the walls, the elevator dinging faintly down the hall. "There's a woman," Laura continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "in the penthouse suite of this hotel, right now, right above us. A woman named Catherine, and Joel has been supporting her financially for 8 years, paying her rent, her bills, everything. I found out tonight because I saw a charge on our credit card statement, a charge to this hotel, for a monthly rate on one of the tower suites. And when I asked him about it during dinner downstairs, during our anniversary dinner, he just ... She laughed again, that broken, terrible sound. He just went white, completely white. And he said we needed to come up to the room, that he had to tell me something, and I thought, God, I'm so stupid. I thought maybe he'd been planning some surprise, that maybe he'd booked a suite for later or something. But no. Instead, he told me about Catherine. Laura turned from the window finally, and in the room's low light, Evan could see that her face had gone beyond grief into something harder, something that looked like rage beginning to crystallize from the molten heat of betrayal. At first, I thought she was his mistress. That's what you'd think, right? Secret payments, hidden relationship, years of lies. But Joel, he actually laughed when I said that. He said, if only it were that simple, Laura. If only I'd just been having an affair. You could divorce me for that, hate me for that, and it would all make sense. But this doesn't make sense. Nothing makes sense. She moved to the bed and sat on its edge, no longer crying, but seeming hollowed out, emptied. Catherine is my half-sister, Laura said, and Evan felt his entire understanding of the situation shift beneath him, like sand giving way. Your half-sister, he repeated, the words foreign in his mouth. My half-sister, Laura confirmed, and now her voice carried a strange, detached quality, as if she were reciting facts about someone else's life. A half-sister I never knew existed. A half-sister my mother never told me about. A half-sister who, according to Joel, has been living in this hotel for 8 years, and my husband has been paying for everything because ... She stopped, her throat working as if the next words physically hurt to say, because my father told him to. Before my father died 6 years ago, he made Joel promise to take care of Catherine, to keep her hidden, to keep her comfortable, and to never, ever tell me she existed. The rooms seemed to contract around them. Evan's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of this impossible story, trying to understand what kind of secret was so toxic that it required 8 years of deception, 8 years of a woman living like a ghost in a hotel, 8 years of a husband lying to his wife. Why? Evan asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. Why would your father do that? Why would Joel agree? Laura's laugh was sharp enough to cut. Money, she said simply. It always comes down to money, doesn't it? My father, Richard Harding, maybe you've heard of him. Harding Development Corporation built half the high-rises on Lakeshore Drive. My father wasn't the self-made man everyone thought he was. He stole. For decades he stole. He embezzled from his own company, from his partners, from pension funds, from everyone stupid enough to trust him. And Catherine, her voice broke. Catherine is the daughter of one of the men my father destroyed. A man named Thomas Kirby, who worked for my father's company for 20 years, before my father framed him for the very crimes my father himself had committed. Thomas went to prison. He died there, of a heart attack, 5 years into a 15-year sentence. And Catherine, his daughter, she was 19 when it happened. 19 years old, and suddenly her father was gone, her family destroyed, her name worthless. Evan felt sick. The champagne bottle on the nightstand gleamed dully in the lamplight, a monument to a celebration that had turned to ashes. He thought about all the times he'd served room service to guests who seemed to have everything: beautiful clothes, expensive jewelry, easy laughter, and wondered how many of them were, like Laura, walking through their lives, completely unaware that the ground beneath them was built on lies. But my father felt guilty, Laura continued, her hands twisting in her lap, fingers knotting and unknotting in an endless pattern. At least, that's what Joel said. After Thomas died in prison, my father tracked down Catherine. She was barely surviving, working 3 jobs, drowning in debt. And my father, God, the cruelty of it, my father offered her money. Lots of money. Enough to live comfortably for the rest of her life. But there were conditions. She had to stay hidden, Evan said, understanding dawning cold and clear. She had to stay hidden, Laura confirmed. She could never contact me, never reveal who she was, never try to claim any part of the Harding family legacy. In exchange, she'd be taken care of. My father set up accounts, trusts, all of it buried under layers of corporate paperwork that would take a forensic accountant years to unravel. And then, when my father got sick, when the cancer ate through him in 6 brutal months, he made Joel promise to continue the arrangement. Joel, who was my fiancé at the time, who had been working at my father's firm, who'd seen things, knew things, my father threatened him, told him that if he didn't take care of Catherine, if he let the secret come out, the entire Harding empire would collapse. My mother, she died 3 years ago, never knew any of this. Joel swears she would have been destroyed. I would have been destroyed. Everything we had would vanish in lawsuits and criminal investigations. Laura stood abruptly, pacing now, her movements jagged and erratic. The torn dress slipped further down her shoulder, but she didn't seem to notice or care. So Joel said yes. Joel promised. And then he married me, Evan, knowing this secret, carrying it like a bomb in his chest stand for 8 years. He's been paying Catherine to exist in silence while I lived my happy little life, completely oblivious. We'd come to this hotel for dinners, for events, for celebrations, and she was here, right above us, breathing the same air, watching maybe, from the tower suite windows, my own blood, and I had no idea. How did you find out? Evan asked. Tonight, I mean. What happened? Laura stopped pacing and turned to face him, her eyes now dry but bright, with a feverish intensity. The credit card charge. I saw it last week when I was doing our monthly budget. The Drake Hotel, a recurring charge of $8,000 a month, going back years. At first I thought it was a mistake, a glitch. But then I started looking closer, and I saw other charges. Deposits to accounts I didn't recognize, cash withdrawals that didn't match our expenses. And tonight, when I asked Joel about it during dinner, when I saw his face go palely new, I knew something was horribly wrong, so I pushed. I demanded answers. And he, ... She sat down heavily in the chair across from Evan, her energy suddenly depleted. He told me everything, right here, in this room. He told me about my father, about Catherine, about the lies. And then, when I asked to meet her, when I demanded to meet her, he said he couldn't let me do that, that it would violate the agreement, that it would put us all at risk. What did you say? Evan asked, leaning forward, completely absorbed in Laura's story, in the magnitude of the betrayal she'd endured. I told him he didn't get to decide that anymore, Laura said, her voice hardening with a steel that hadn't been there before. I told him that I was going to the penthouse right now, that I was going to meet Catherine whether he liked it or not, and that if he tried to stop me, I would burn everything down. Our marriage, his career, the Harding name, all of it. I would go to the police, to the press, to anyone who would listen, and I would tell them exactly what my father did and what Joel helped cover up. And that's when he left, Evan said. That's when he left, Laura confirmed. He said, and I'll never forget this. Never, he said. You're going to regret this, Laura. You think you want the truth, but the truth will destroy you. And then he walked out that door, and I just She gestured weakly at the floor where Evan had found her. I fell apart. I couldn't stand, couldn't breathe, couldn't process that my entire life has been a performance, and I didn't even know I was acting. The wind outside intensified, rattling the windows so violently that Evan instinctively glanced toward them, half expecting the glass to shatter. The storm that had been threatening all evening was arriving in full force, and he could hear the first pattering of sleet against the building's exterior, that distinctive sound of ice crystals hitting stone and glass. What are you going to do? Evan asked quietly. Laura met his eyes, and what he saw there made his breath catch. Gone was the broken woman on the floor. Gone was the devastated wife crying over a shattered marriage. What remained was something sharper, something forged in the heat of revelation and cooled in the ice of betrayal. Resolve. I'm going to meet my sister, Laura said, and the word sister carried weight, intention, claim. I'm going to go upstairs to that penthouse, and I'm going to knock on her door, and I'm going to meet the woman whose existence has shaped my life without my knowledge. And then, she paused, considering, then I'm going to figure out what the truth actually is. Not Joel's version, not my father's version, the truth. Evan nodded slowly. Do you want me to come with you? The question surprised them both. Evan hadn't planned to say. It had violated every boundary between staff and guest, every protocol in the employee handbook, every shred of common sense. But looking at Laura, at the determination in her devastated face, at the courage it must take to stand up after being knocked so completely down, he found he couldn't let her walk into that confrontation alone. Laura stared at him for a long moment, and Evan saw her, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a hotel employee, not as an accidental intruder, but as a human being offering something rare and precious, solidarity in the face of chaos. You don't even know me, she said softly. No, Evan agreed, but I know what it's like to have your life fall apart and feel like you're drowning in the wreckage, that I know what it's like to be alone with something too big to carry by yourself, and I know that sometimes the kindest thing a stranger can do is just stay. Laura's eyes filled with tears again, but these were different, not the tears of devastation, but of something that might have been gratitude or recognition, or the simple relief of not being alone. Why? She whispered. Why would you do this for me? Evan thought about Mia, about sitting in that hospital room as machines beeped their final rhythms, about walking out into a world that kept spinning despite the fact that his entire family was now gone, about the strangers who'd shown him unexpected kindness in the years since, the bodega owner who'd let him pay for groceries on credit when his paycheck was late, the bus driver who'd waited an extra 30 seconds when Evan was running to catch the last bus home, the old woman in his apartment building who'd left homemade soup outside his door when she heard him coughing. Small acts, unremarkable to most, life-saving to him, because someone did it for me once, Evan said simply, when I needed it, and I promised myself that if I ever saw someone drowning the way I'd been drowning, I'd throw them a rope, even if it was just a thin one. Laura nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. She stood, smoothing down her torn dress as best she could, wiping the smeared makeup from her face with the back of her hand in a gesture that was both futile and necessary. Okay, she said. Okay, let's do this. But first, she walked to the dresser and picked up something Evan hadn't noticed before, a keycard, identical to the one Evan used for room service, but this one had something written on the back in ballpoint pen. Laura held it up, her hand steady now. Joel left this. He didn't mean to. It fell out of his wallet when he grabbed his things, but I found it after he left. Look. She handed the card to Evan. The front showed the Drake Hotel's logo in gold embossing. The back had a handwritten note in neat, masculine script. PH2, Tuesday nights. 10 p.m., code, Lighthouse. PH2, Evan said. Penthouse 2, that must be Catherine's room. Tuesday nights, Laura repeated, her voice hollow. Every Tuesday for 8 years. My husband has been coming to this hotel at 10 p.m. every Tuesday. He told me he had late client meetings or dinner with colleagues. Every Tuesday he was visiting her, not as a lover, he swore that, and I actually believe him, which is maybe the worst part. He was visiting her as a jailer visits a prisoner, or a zookeeper checks on an animal, bringing her money, making sure she was staying quiet, keeping the secret buried. Evan felt anger rising in his chest, not for himself, but for Laura, for Catherine, for all the ways powerful men engineered the lives of others to protect their own interests. His father had been a mechanic, honest to a fault, and it had kept them poor. But looking at Laura now, at what wealth and lies had cost her, Evan thought maybe his father's honesty had been a gift more precious than any inheritance. There's more, Laura said, taking the keycard back and walking to her suitcase. She knelt beside it, unzipping a side pocket, and pulled out a small manila envelope, the kind lawyers use for documents. Joel had this too. I found it in his briefcase. He'd left it on the chair, and when I was looking for Tissues after he left, I saw it. I shouldn't have opened it. It's probably some kind of violation, attorney-client privilege or something. But Evan, she looked up at him, her face pale. This changes everything. She handed him the envelope. Inside were photocopies of documents, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, legal contracts. Evan wasn't a financial expert, but even he could see the staggering numbers involved. Hundreds of thousands of dollars moving through accounts, some domestic, some offshore, names he didn't recognize alongside corporate entities that sounded deliberately bland and forgettable. The payments to Catherine, Laura explained, they're not coming from Joel's personal accounts. They're not even coming from my father's estate. They're coming from something called the Drake Hospitality Trust. And look at the date. It goes back 30 years, Evan. 30 years. Long before my father died. Long before Joel was even in the picture. Evan's eyes scanned the documents, finding the pattern Laura had identified. The Drake Hospitality Trust had been making regular payments to dozens of people over 3 decades, and the amounts were astronomical. What is this? He asked. I don't know, Laura admitted, but I think my father didn't just steal from his company. I think he was running something bigger, something that involved this hotel and other people. And Catherine is just one piece of a much larger secret, and Joel knows about it. Joel's been managing it since my father died. My husband, the lawyer, the man I trusted with everything, has been the keeper of all these secrets. She stood, taking the documents back and tucking them into her Persa designer bag that probably cost more than Evan made in a month, he noted, with a strange sense of disconnection. So when I go upstairs to meet Catherine, I'm not just meeting my sister. I'm opening a door that my father and Joel both wanted to stay closed, and I have no idea what's on the other side. Maybe you shouldn't go alone, Evan said again, more urgently this time. Maybe we should call someone, the police, a lawyer, someone who can what? Laura interrupted, and there was fire in her voice now. Protect me from the truth. Help me continue living a lie. Evan, my marriage is over. My understanding of my family is destroyed. My entire identity as Richard Harding's daughter, has been built on theft and cover-ups, and a half-sister kept in a cage. I don't get to unsee what I've already seen. The only choice I have now is whether to keep running from the truth or walk straight into it. She was right, and Evan knew it, but that didn't make the cold feeling in his stomach dissipate. "Okay," he said, standing and squaring his shoulders. "Then let's go. But Laura, be prepared for this to get worse before it gets better. Secrets this big, they don't just hurt the people keeping them. They hurt everyone they touch." "I know," Laura said quietly. She walked to the mirror above the dresser and looked at herself, freely looked, taking in the torn dress, the ruined makeup, the wild hair. For a moment, Evan thought she might try to clean herself up, to put on the armor of respectability before facing Catherine. But instead, she nodded, as if accepting her own reflection. "Good. Let us see what this has cost me. Let us see exactly what these lies look like." They walked to the door together, Evan retrieving his tray from where he'd set it earlier, Laura clutching her purse with the incriminating documents. As Evan opened the door, cold air from the hallway rushed in, carrying with it the smell of the building's aged carpet cleaner and floor polish, and the accumulated scent of thousands of lives passing through. The corridor was empty, the other guests behind their doors, unaware that in room 706, a woman's entire world had just been torn apart and reassembled into something unrecognizable. "Wait," Laura said, as they stepped into the hall. She turned to Evan, her green eyes searching his face. "I still don't understand why you're doing this. You could lose your job. You could get in serious trouble for being in my room, for leaving your post, for getting involved in a guest's personal crisis. Why risk all that for someone you don't know?" Evan set the tray down on the hallway carpety. "Deal with the abandoned order to 607 later. Would probably have to remake it. Would definitely have to explain to his supervisor where he'd been. But none of that mattered in this moment, because 3 years ago I was working a different job, a worse job, at a warehouse on the south side, and my little sister Mia, her name was Mia, she called me one night during a snowstorm. She was scared. Her car had broken down on I-90, and it was late, and she was alone. I told her to call a tow truck, that I couldn't leave work, that I'd get fired if I left early. I chose the job over her, and an hour later, a semi-truck lost control on the ice and hit her car while she was waiting on the shoulder." The words came out flat, emotionless, the way they always did when Evan talked about that night. He'd told the story so many times to police, to his supervisor, to Mia's friends at the memorial service, to the therapist the hospital social worker had recommended, that it had become a script, lines delivered by an actor who'd long since left the stage. But Laura's face crumpled with empathy, and she reached out, her hand closing around Evan's wrist with surprising strength. "Oh God," she whispered. "Evan, I'm so sorry. She died because I wasn't there," Evan continued, his voice still that awful monotone. "She died alone, scared, because I chose a warehouse job that paid $9 an hour over my baby sister. And I swore, after they buried her, that I would never make that choice again, that if someone needed help, really needed it, I would be there. Job or no job, rules or no rules, I would be there." The hallways seemed to shrink around them, the amber lights dimming, the wind outside growing louder. Laura's grip on his wrist tightened, and Evan could feel her pulse through her fingers, fast, erratic, alive. "You can't blame yourself for that," Laura said fiercely. "That wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known." "No," Evan agreed. "I couldn't have known. But I know now. I know that the moment you choose convenience over compassion, choose self-preservation over solidarity, choose fear over love, that's the moment you become complicit in whatever happens next. So when I opened that door tonight and saw you on the floor, saw you drowning the way I drowned after Mia died, I knew I couldn't walk away. Not again. Not ever again. Laura released his wrist and stepped back, nodding slowly. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried the weight of understanding, of recognition that sometimes strangers become allies not through choice, but through the simple act of showing up when it matters most. They walked to the elevator together, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. The elevator arrived with a soft ding that seemed too cheerful for the gravity of what they were about to do. As the doors opened, Evan caught sight of their reflection in the polished brass interior, a room service waiter in his slightly rumpled vest and a devastated woman in a torn dress, an unlikely pair united by circumstance and the terrible courage required to face truth when lies are easier. The elevator had only 2 buttons beyond the numbered floors, PH-1 and PH2. Laura pressed PH-2 with a steady finger, and the elevator lurched upward, climbing past the 6th floor, past the 7th, past the regular guest rooms, toward the tower suites, where Chicago's wealthiest visitors stayed when they wanted privacy and privilege. "Evan," Laura said as they rose, "if this goes badly, if Catherine calls security, if Joel shows up, if any of this spirals into something dangerous, I want you to leave. Just walk away. Don't let my catastrophe become yours." "Not how this works," Evan said simply. "You don't get to protect me from my own choices. I'm here because I decided to be here. What happens next? We face it together." The elevator slowed, and Evan felt his heart rate spike. He'd never been to the penthouse. Level room service to the tower suites was typically handled by senior staff, the ones who'd been at the Drake long enough to be trusted with the hotel's most demanding and secretive guests. The doors opened onto a hallway that was noticeably different from the 6th floor. The carpet was thicker, more luxurious, the walls covered in silk wallpaper that probably costs more per square foot than Evan's monthly rent. The lighting warmer and more carefully designed. There were only 4 doors on this level, spaced far apart to maximize privacy, each marked with discreet brass letters instead of numbers. Plated was to the left, at the far end of the hall. Through the massive windows that looked out over Lake Michigan, Evan could see the storm in full fury, now sleet mixed with snow whipping horizontally past the glass. The lake beyond, invisible in the darkness, except for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the churning water. They walked slowly toward the door, and with each step, Evan felt the magnitude of what they were doing settle more heavily on his shoulder. Behind that door was a woman who had been living in isolation for 8 years, a woman whose existence was predicated on silence, a woman whose life had been destroyed by Laura's father and then commodified into monthly payments and secret visits. What would it do to Catherine to have Laura appear now? What would it do to Laura to meet the sister she'd never known, the ghost who'd haunted the edges of her life? As they reached the door, Laura raised her hand to knock, then hesitated. "What if she doesn't want to meet me?" she asked, her voice suddenly small, uncertain. "What if she hates me? What if—" "Then you'll know," Evan said gently. "That's what you came here for, right? To know. To stop living in a world built on lies and half-truths. Whatever's behind this door, it's real. And real is better than the alternative, even when it hurts." Laura took a deep breath, steadying herself, and knocked 3 times firm. Deliberate knocks that echoed in the quiet hallway. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they heard movement inside, footsteps, slow and cautious, approaching the door. A pause. The sound of breathing on the other side of the wood. Someone listening, perhaps sensing through some animal instinct that the person on the other side of the threshold wasn't Joel, wasn't the usual Tuesday night visit, wasn't safe. "Who is it?" a voice called out, feminine and wary, with an accent that suggested Chicago but with something else underneath, maybe the remnants of working-class South Side, the kind of accent that expensive private schools and years of isolation can soften but never quite erase. "My name is Laura," Laura said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Laura Westfield, Richard Harding's daughter, and I'm here to meet my sister." The silence that followed was absolute, so complete that Evan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, could hear the sleet rattling against the windows, could hear the building itself breathing around them. Then the door opened. The woman who stood in the doorway was thin, not fashionably thin, but with the gauntness of someone who didn't eat regularly or well, someone whose body was being slowly eroded by stress or illness, or the simple weight of carrying impossible secrets. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, pale skin that suggested she didn't go outside often, and eyes that were Laura's eyes, the same shade of green hazel, the same shape, the unmistakable marker of shared blood. Catherine Kirby stared at Laura with an expression that cycled through disbelief, fear, and finally something that might have been longing, the look of someone who'd been alone for so long that the presence of another human, especially one connected by blood, was both terrifying and desperately desired. "You shouldn't be here," Catherine whispered, but she didn't close the door. "Joel said you'd never know. He promised. It was the agreement." "The agreement's broken," Laura said, and her voice shook now, emotion cracking through her careful control. "I know everything, Catherine. I know about our father, about what he did to yours, about the money, about Joel keeping you here. And her voice broke completely. "I have a sister. I have a sister, and I didn't know. How could they do that to us? How could they rob us of each other?" Catherine's face crumpled, and Evan saw tears spill down her cheek, stares that looked like they'd been waiting years to fall. "You don't understand," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "You can't be here. If you're here, if you know, then everything your father built to protect you falls apart. The agreement was that I stay quiet, stay hidden, and in return, your reputation stays clean, your inheritance stays safe. You get to live a normal life while She gestured helplessly at the suite behind her, at the gilded cage that had been in her prison, "while I get to exist." That was the deal. "I don't want that deal," Laura said fiercely, stepping forward so that she and Catherine were nearly touching, separated only by the threshold between hallway and suite. "I don't want a life built on your silence. I don't want an inheritance bought with your father's suffering. I want the truth, Catherine, all of it. And then I want to figure out how we fix this, how we fix us." Catherine stared at her half-sister, and Evan watched as decades of isolation and resentment and carefully suppressed hope poured across her features. Finally she stepped back, opening the door wider, an invitation, an acceptance, a leap of faith into unknown territory. "Then you'd better come in," Catherine said quietly, "'cause if you really want the truth, it's going to take all night. And it's going to hurt more than you can possibly imagine." Laura walked through the doorway, and Evan followed, the door closing behind them with a soft click that sounded like the sealing of a tomb or the opening of a door that had been locked for far too long. The suite was large and expensively furnished, but it had the sterile quality of a space that wasn't really lived in. No personal photographs, no clutter, no signs of a life being actively built. It looked like a hotel room, because that's exactly what it was. A place of temporary residence that had somehow become permanent, a nowhere space for a woman who existed nowhere. Catherine led them to the sitting area, where floor-to-ceiling windows showed the storm raging outside. Lightning flashed across the lake, illuminating the white-capped waves for brief, spectacular moments before darkness reclaimed everything. They sat, Laura and Catherine, facing each other on a cream-colored sofa, Evan taking a chair slightly apart, present, but trying to give them space for this reunion that was also a reckoning. "Where do I even start?" Catherine said, her hands knotted in her lap, mirroring Laura's earlier gesture. The sisters, Evan realized, shared more than eyes. They had the same nervous habits, the same way of tilting their heads when uncertain, the same fierce intelligence burning behind their expressions. "Start with my father," Laura said. "Start with what he did." And Catherine began to speak, her voice soft but steady, telling a story that unwound decades of lies, had exposed the rotten foundation upon which Laura's entire life had been built. She spoke of her father, Thomas Kirby, a good man, an honest man, who'd worked for Richard Harding's development company for 20 years and had eventually discovered what his boss was doing, skimming money from construction projects, falsifying safety inspections, bribing city officials, running a sophisticated embezzlement scheme that funneled millions of dollars into offshore accounts. "My dad went to Richard first," Catherine said, her eyes distant, looking into a past that still haunted her. "He didn't go to the police or the press. He went to his boss, the man he'd trusted, the man who'd been to our house for barbecues, who'd given me birthday presents, who'd seemed like family. And Richard looked him in the eye and said he'd take care of it, that he'd fix everything." She laughed bitterly. What Richard fixed was the evidence. He altered records, created a paper trail that made it look like my dad was the one stealing, that my dad was the one taking bribes. And then Richard went to the prosecutor's office himself and turned in no evidence he'd manufactured. Laura's face had gone ashen. "No," she whispered. "He wouldn't. My father wouldn't do that." "Your father did exactly that," Catherine said, and there was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. "My dad was arrested at work, in front of everyone. I was 19 in my second year of college. My mother had died when I was 12, so it was just the two of us. And suddenly, the FBI was raiding our house, seizing everything, and my dad was being charged with 20 counts of fraud and embezzlement. He told me he was innocent, Laura. He told me Richard had framed him, but who was going to believe that? Richard Harding, pillar of the community, versus Thomas Kirby, angry employee. My dad was convicted on 16 counts. He got 15 years. Evan felt nauseous. He'd grown up around honest working people, people who struggled to pay rent and feed their families, people who played by the rules, even when the rules were rigged against them. The idea that someone like Richard Harding could simply destroy a man's life to cover his own crimes was enraging and yet entirely unsurprising. "He died in prison," Catherine continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. 5 years in, heart attack. He was 53 years old. I was 24, working 3 jobs to pay off his legal fees, and I got a call from the prison chaplain telling me my dad was gone. I didn't even have money to give him a proper funeral. He's buried in a state cemetery, a number on a marker, because I couldn't afford anything better. Laura was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. "Catherine, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Catherine said gently, and she reached out, her hand hovering over Laura's for a moment before making contact, fingers intertwining. "You were what, 16 when my dad went to prison? 17 when he died. You were a kid. How could you know what your father was really doing? And Richard, he kept it all hidden from you, from your mother, from everyone. He was good at compartmentalizing, at maintaining the facade. When did he contact you?" Laura asked. When did he come find you?" "About 6 months after my dad died," Catherine replied. "I was a mess, working overnight shifts at a hospital, day shifts at a coffee shop, living in a studio apartment in Englewood that had rats and no heat. I was drowning in debt, surviving on ramen and whatever I could steal from the hospital cafeteria. And then one day, Richard Harding showed up at my apartment, just knocked on the door like it was nothing, like his presence wasn't the most surreal thing that had ever happened to me." She stood and walked to the window, her back to them, her reflection ghostly in the glass against the storm beyond. "He told me he was sorry. That's what he said. I'm sorry for what happened to your father, Catherine. I'm sorry for what I did, and God, I lost it. I screamed at him. I threw things. I told him sorry, didn't bring back my dad, didn't give me back the years I'd lost, didn't undo the damage. And you know what he did? He just stood there and took it. Just let me rage until I had nothing left. And then he made me an offer." "The money," Laura said dully. "The money," Catherine confirmed. "He said he couldn't undo what he'd done, couldn't bring my father back, couldn't clear his name without destroying himself, and Dan, this is important, without destroying you and your mother. He said, if the truth came out, everything would collapse. The company, the family fortune, your mother's health. She had a heart condition, right?" "Yes," Laura whispered. "She had congestive heart failure. Stress could have killed her. Richard used that," Catherine said, turning back to face them. "He said if I went public, if I tried to clear my father's name, the investigation would kill your mother, would bankrupt the company, would ruin you. He painted it as a choice. I could have justice for my dad, or I could spare you and your mother. And he sweetened it, God, the cruelty of it. He sweetened it by telling me that you and I were sisters. That's when he told me. He said my dad and your mum had an affair before she married Richard, that I was the result, and that Richard had known all along. He'd married your mother despite her pregnancy, had raised you as his own, but he'd always known I existed." Nora made a sound like she'd been punched, a sharp exhalation of disbelief. "My mother had an affair with your father, according to Richard," Catherine said. "I don't know if it's true. I have no way to verify it. Both our parents are dead. But Richard showed me photographs, letters. He had documentation. And he said that because we were sisters, because we shared blood, he wanted to take care of me the way he'd taken care of you. He offered me a stipend, a place to live, medical care, everything I needed. In exchange, I had to disappear, change my name, cut all ties with anyone who knew me as Catherine Kirby. Never contact you or your mother, never try to claim any part of the Harding family. I would be provided for, but I would be invisible." "And you agreed," Laura said, and there was no judgment in her voice, only sadness. "I was 24, Laura. I was exhausted and broken and alone. My father was dead, buried as a criminal. I had no family, no money, no future that I could see. And Richard was offering me a way to survive, a way to stop the constant struggle just to eat and pay rent. So yes, I agreed. I signed the papers his lawyers put in front of me. I became Catherine Harding. Taking his name felt like the ultimate insult, but it was part of the deal, and I moved into this suite, this gilded cage." She gestured around the room, at the expensive furniture, and the tasteful artwork, and the minibar stocked with premium liquor. 8 years, Laura. 8 years I've been here, in this hotel, on this floor. I can leave for a few hours each day, usually at night, when fewer people are around, but I can't build a real life. Can't have friends who come visit, because how would I explain living in a hotel permanently? Can't get a real job, because the agreement stipulates that I can't earn income that might give me financial independence beyond what Richard's trust provides. I exist in this weird limbo, neither prisoner nor free person. And Joel," her voice hardened, "Joel has been the warden since your father died." "What did Joel know?" Laura asked urgently. "When did he find out?" "Your father brought him into it about a year before Richard died," Catherine said. "Joel was working for the firm, specializing in corporate law and estate planning. Richard was setting up his will, making sure the arrangements for me would continue after his death, and he needed someone he could trust to manage it. Joel was young, ambitious, eager to please his future father-in-law. And Richard, he was smart about it. He showed Joel enough of the evidence to make it clear that revealing the truth would destroy the Harding family. But he framed it as protecting you, Laura. He told Joel that keeping me secret was an act of love, of shielding you from your father's sins. And Joel believed that? Laura asked, her voice rising. He thought lying to me for 8 years was love. I think Joel convinced himself of that, Catherine said carefully. Every Tuesday night, he'd come here. He'd bring me cash, ask if I needed anything, make sure I was following the rules. And he'd talk about you, Laura. He'd tell me stories about your job, your friends, your hopes for a family. He seemed to genuinely love you, but he also seemed to believe that protecting you from the truth was more important than your right to know it. That's not love, Laura said bitterly. That's control. That's deciding what I can and can't handle, what I deserve to know about my own life. She stopped, struggling for words adequate to the betrayal. I know, Catherine said softly. Believe me, I know. I've had 8 years to think about all the ways this arrangement is toxic, all the ways Richard's guilt money has poisoned everything it touches. But Laura, there's more. There's something Joel was managing that goes beyond just the payments to me. She walked to a desk in the corner of the room and retrieved a laptop, expensive model. Evan noted, but one that looked heavily used, the keys worn smooth from constant typing. Catherine opened it, her fingers flying across the keyboard, and then turned the screen toward Laura and Evan. What Evan saw made his breath catch. The screen showed a spreadsheet, dense with names and dates and dollar amounts that stretched back decades. There were dozens of names, maybe hundreds, each with associated monthly payments ranging from a few thousand to tens of thousands of dollars. The Drake Hospitality Trust, Catherine said. It's not just for me. It never was. Richard was paying off dozens of people, Laura. Everyone he'd ever wronged, everyone who knew too much, everyone who could potentially expose him. He built an entire infrastructure of hush money disguised as a charitable trust. Laura leaned forward, her eyes scanning the names. Some Evan recognized, prominent Chicago families, politicians, business leaders. Others were clearly working-class people, their addresses in neighborhoods like Englewood, Austin, Pilsen. Who are all these people? Laura asked. Victims, Catherine said simply, or their survivors. The widow of a construction worker who died in an accident at one of Richard's buildings, an accident that was covered up because proper safety measures would have cut into profits. The family of a city inspector who discovered building code violations and was fired and blacklisted when he refused Richard's bribe. Former employees who saw Richard's financial crimes and were paid to stay quiet. It goes on and on, Laura. Your father spent decades hurting people and then buying their silence. And money to do it. She clicked to another tab, showing bank accounts and investment portfolios. The money came from the very crimes he committed. He stole from his company, from pension funds, from construction budgets, and then used that stolen money to pay off the people he'd stolen from. It's circular, perverse. Evan felt like the room was spinning. He thought about all the times he'd served wealthy guests in this hotel, had smiled and nodded, and pretended not to notice when they were rude or dismissive or treated him like he was invisible. He'd always known that wealth often came with a cost, that fortunes were usually built on someone else's exploitation. But seeing it laid out so starkly, seeing the literal spreadsheet of human suffering transformed into monthly payments, made him feel complicit somehow, as if working in this building made him part of the machine that kept these secrets buried. Joel's been managing this, Laura asked, her face pale. For 6 years, Catherine confirmed. Every month, he reviews the trust, approves the payments, handles any issues that arise. Some of the original recipients have died, and Joel has to decide whether to continue payments to their heirs. Some people have tried to ask for more money, and Joel has to negotiate threaten, whatever it takes to keep them quiet. It's a full-time job, managing your father's legacy of harm. And the hotel? Evan heard himself ask, the question escaping before he'd fully formed it. The Drake, what's its role in all this? Catherine looked at him, really seeing him for the first time, and Evan saw recognition flicker in her eyes, the recognition of a fellow outsider, someone else caught in the gravitational pull of wealthy people's secrets. Good question, she said. The Drake has been complicit from the beginning, not the whole hotel, obviously, but certain members of senior management, people who've been here for decades. They know. They know I'm here on Richard Harding's dime. They know about the monthly payments, the cash deliveries, the need for discretion, and they're paid well for their silence and cooperation. Look, she scrolled through the spreadsheet to a section marked Operational Expenses, and Evan saw several names he recognized. The general manager, the head of security, Dina from the front desk. His stomach dropped. Dina, who'd always been kind to him, who'd helped him navigate hotel politics when he was new, who'd seemed like one of the good ones. She'd been part of this all along. She'd been taking money to help Richard Harding maintain his web of secrets. How much do they get? Laura asked, her voice hollow. $5,000 a month, Catherine said. Each. For turning a blind eye, for making sure certain records stay private, for ensuring that no one asks too many questions about the woman who lives permanently in PH2. It's a good gig, if you can stomach the moral compromise. Laura stood abruptly and walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cold glass the same way she had in room 706. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, the sleet now mixed with heavy snow that swirled in chaotic patterns against the building's facade. I can't, ... double quotes, she started, then stopped. I don't know how to process this. Everything I thought I knew about my father, about Joel, about my own life, it's all been a lie. And not just a lie, but a lie built on suffering, on my father destroying people and then paying them to pretend it never happened. I feel like I should give it all back, every dollar I have ever inherited, every advantage I have ever had. How can I keep any of it knowing what it costs? That's exactly how I felt, Catherine said quietly, when I accepted Richard's money. Like I was betraying my father by taking anything from the man who killed him. But Laura, we can't undo the past. We can't bring back the people who were hurt or make right what was made wrong. All we can do is decide what we do next. With the knowledge we now have. Laura turned from the window, and Evan saw something shift in her expression, giving way to determination, confusion crystallizing into clarity. The documents Joel has, she said, the ones about the trust, about the payments, they're evidence, aren't they? Evidence of fraud, of conspiracy, of what would you even call this? A criminal enterprise? Racketeering, probably, Catherine said. RICO charges, maybe. Wire fraud, definitely. If the right prosecutor saw these records, they could build a case that would unravel everything Richard built and take down everyone who helped him maintain it, including Joel. Including you? Laura asked. Catherine nodded. Including me. I've been accepting payments I knew were probably illegal for 8 years. I could be charged as an accessory after the fact, or with something similar. I've thought about that a lot, actually. Whether it would be worth it to blow everything up, even if it meant going down with the ship. Some days, I think yes. Other days, she looked around the suite, at her comfortable prison. Other days, I'm just too tired to burn it all down. Laura crossed the room and took Catherine's hands in hers, holding them tightly. What if we burned it down together? She said, her voice intense. What if we took everything, all the documents, all the evidence, everything Joel has been hiding, and we went to the authorities, not to protect my father's reputation or preserve my inheritance, but to finally give your father justice, to clear his name and expose what really happened. Catherine stared at her half-sister, and Evan saw tears forming in her eyes. "Laura, if we do that, you'll lose everything. The money, the family name, probably your freedom for a while during the investigation. Your whole world implodes. Are you really ready for that?" My whole world already imploded," Laura said simply. "It happened the moment Joel told me the truth. There's no going back to not knowing. So the only question is whether I let that implosion be meaningless, or whether I use it to actually change something. And I choose change. I choose truth. I choose," her voice cracked with emotion, "I choose my sister. Even if I just met you an hour ago. Even if this costs me everything else. I choose you." Catherine's breath caught at Laura's words, and for a long moment, the two sisters simply held each other's hands across the expensive coffee table while the storm raged outside, and Evan sat witness to this impossible reunion. The weight of what Laura had just offered, the willingness to sacrifice everything for a sister she'd only just met, for a truth that would destroy her, hung in the air like something sacred and terrible. "You don't know what you're saying," Catherine whispered finally, but her grip on Laura's hands tightened rather than released. "You're angry right now, and hurt, and you want to strike back at Joel and your father's memory. But Laura, once we open this door, once we hand these documents to prosecutors, there's no closing it again. Your life as you know it ends. Every friend you have, every professional connection, every social circle, they'll all evaporate when your name becomes associated with your father's crimes. You'll be marked." "I'm already marked," Laura said, and there was steel in her voice now, the kind forged in fire and loss. "The moment I found out the truth, I became complicit in its concealment if I do nothing. And Catherine, I've spent 12 years building a life on foundations I didn't know were rotten. My marriage, my career as a fundraiser for children's charities, God. The irony of that, raising money for children while my father was destroying families. My friendships with people whose respect was based on being Richard Harding's daughter. None of it was real. So what exactly am I losing if I burn it down? A comfortable lie? I'd rather live in uncomfortable truth." Evan found himself nodding, recognizing something of his own journey in Laura's words. After Mia died, after he'd lost everything that mattered, he'd discovered a strange freedom in having nothing left to lose. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the only way forward was to jump and trust you'd figure out how to fly on the way down. Catherine released Laura's hands and stood, pacing now, her thin frame taut with tension. "Okay," she said, her voice taking on a practical edge. "Okay, let's say we do this. Let's say we gather everything we have, my records, the documents you found in Joel's briefcase, everything I've copied from his laptop when he leaves it here during his visits, and we take it to the authorities. Who do we trust? The Chicago PD? The FBI? The state's attorney? Because Laura, your father, had connections everywhere. The reason this has stayed buried so long is because Richard knew exactly who to pay off, who to threaten, who to compromise. Half the city's power structure has either benefited from his crimes or been paid to ignore them. Then we go federal," Laura said immediately. "FBI Public Corruption Unit. We bypass local law enforcement entirely. And we don't just hand over documents. We need to be strategic. We need to protect ourselves, make sure we're seen as cooperating witnesses rather than co-conspirators. We need—" She stopped, frustration flickering across her face. "We need a lawyer. Someone who specializes in white-collar crime and whistleblower protection. Someone who isn't connected to Joel or my father's firm." "I know someone," Evan said quietly, and both women turned to look at him, seeming almost surprised to find him still there. He'd been so quiet, so careful not to intrude on their reunion, that he'd become nearly invisible, the way service workers so often became to people like Laura in her previous life. But now, with both sisters' eyes on him, Evan felt the responsibility of what he was about to offer. My sister, Mia, before she died, she was in law school at Northwestern. She had a study partner, Marcus Chun, who graduated 2 years ago and now works at a firm that specializes in whistleblower cases and government fraud litigation. I went to her memorial service, and afterward, Marcus told me that if I ever needed anything, legal or otherwise, I should call him. He gave me his card. "Do you still have it?" Laura asked urgently. "I do," Evan said. "It's in my locker downstairs. I kept it because—" He paused, feeling foolish. "I kept it because it was one of the last connections I had to Mia's life, to the future she was building before the accident. I've never called him, never needed to. But if you want, I can get it right now, and we can reach out." "It's almost 4 a.m., Catherine pointed out, glancing at the clock on the suite's wall. "Then we call him at 8 a.m., Laura said decisively, "when his office opens. In the meantime, we need to gather everything. Catherine, you said you've been copying files from Joel's laptop. What exactly do you have?" Catherine returned to her computer and pulled up multiple folders, each labeled with dates and cryptic abbreviations. "Everything," she said simply. "Every time Joel comes here on Tuesday nights, he brings his laptop to work while we talk. He thinks he's being careful. He uses passwords, encryption, the works. But he also drinks. Usually a scotch or two, sometimes 3 if he's had a stressful day. And about a year ago, when he was particularly drunk and particularly stressed about managing one of the trust's beneficiaries who was threatening to go public, he stepped away to use the bathroom and left his laptop unlocked. I saw the files he had open, spreadsheets, bank records, all of it, and I made a decision." She looked at Laura, her expression both defiant and ashamed. "I installed monitoring software on his computer. Nothing sophisticated, just a basic keylogger that captures his passwords and a program that mirrors everything on his hard drive to my laptop. Every document he creates, every email he sends, every edit he makes to the trust files, I have copies of all of it. I told myself I was doing it for protection, in case Joel ever decided to eliminate me or change the terms of the arrangement. But really," her voice dropped to a whisper, "really, I think I was waiting for someone like you, Laura. Someone who could actually use this information to do something, to change something. I was too much of a coward to do it myself." "You're not a coward," Laura said fiercely. "You survived. You endured 8 years of isolation and uncertainty, and you prepared for the possibility of justice even when it seemed impossible. That's not cowardice, that's hope." Catherine's eyes glistened with tears, but she blinked them back and refocused on the screen. "The most damning files are the originals of what your father called his insurance policy. Before he died, Richard created detailed documentation of every crime he'd ever committed, every person he'd paid off, every instance of fraud and corruption. He did it as leverage if anyone ever tried to bring him down. He'd threatened to release information that would take dozens of powerful people with him. Mutually assured destruction. Where are the originals?" Evan asked, his mind racing ahead to the tactical considerations. If there are hard copies somewhere, just having digital files might not be enough. "Safety deposit box," Catherine said. "Wells Fargo Bank, Michigan Avenue branch. Joel has access as executor of Richard's estate. The box number and access codes are in the files I copied. He keeps that information in a password-protected document that I have been monitoring." "But Laura," she turned to her sister, her face grave. "Opening that box without Joel's permission would be illegal. It would be breaking and entering, theft, tampering with an estate. It could jeopardize any case we try to build." "Not if I open it," Laura said slowly, realization dawning. "I'm Richard Harding's daughter and heir. Legally, I have standing to access my father's estate documents, especially if I suspect the executor, my husband, is mismanaging assets. I could petition for access, or even just show up with identification and a copy of the will showing I'm a beneficiary. Banks are usually cooperative with family members, especially ones who look like they belong. She gestured at herself with bitter irony, which I do, despite this disaster of a dress. Catherine considered this, her expression thoughtful. It could work, especially if we time it right. The bank opens at 9 a.m. If we get there when they open, before Joel realizes, about the safety deposit box, you might be able to access it and remove the contents before he can stop you. Then that's the plan, Laura said, and Evan heard in her voice the tone of someone who'd made up their mind and wouldn't be dissuaded. At 8 a.m., Evan calls his contact at the law firm and explains the situation. At 9 a.m., I go to the bank and access the safety deposit box. We remove the physical evidence, photograph everything, and turn it over to the lawyer. And then, she took a deep breath. Then we go to the FBI and we tell them everything. Joel will fight back, Catherine warned. He has resources, connections, the entire infrastructure of your father's firm behind him. And Laura, he's still your husband. Illinois is not a no-fault divorce state. If you expose him, if you destroy his career and reputation, the divorce is going to be brutal. He'll try to paint you as unstable, vindictive, maybe even claim you're the one who knew about the trust all along and are now trying to pin it on him. Let him try, Laura said coldly. I have you. I have these files. I have the truth. And I'm done being protected from reality by men who think they know what's best for me. Evan checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. The storm outside had shifted, the sleet tapering off, but the snow intensifying, already accumulating on the window ledges in thick white drifts. In a few hours, Chicago would wake up to a blanket of white covering the city's grime and corruption. A temporary cleansing that would melt by afternoon and reveal the same dirty streets beneath. But sometimes, Evan thought, temporary transformations were enough to show you what was possible, to give you a glimpse of what clean could look like. We need to get those documents from Joel's briefcase, Evan said, pulling them back to immediate logistics. Laura, you said you found them in room 706. Are they still there, or did you bring them with you? Laura looked stricken. I left them. I was so focused on confronting Catherine that I just left them on the desk in the room. Joel's briefcase is probably still there too. He left in such a hurry that he only grabbed his wallet and phone. The briefcase, the documents, everything else is still in 706. We need to get them now, Catherine said urgently, before Joel realizes he left them, before he goes back for them. Those documents are physical evidence, and without them, we have your digital copies, Laura pointed out. Digital can be challenged, Catherine countered. Defense lawyers love to claim files were altered or fabricated. Physical documents, originals with fingerprints and handwriting and paper trails, those are much harder to discredit. If Joel realizes what he left behind and gets to that room before we do, he'll destroy them. He has to. Laura was already moving toward the door. Then let's go. Right now. We go back to 706. We secure everything, and... She stopped abruptly, a new thought occurring to her. Wait. Joel has a key to that room. What if he's already there? What if he went back while I was up here with you? The three of them stood frozen, considering this possibility. If Joel had returned to room 706 and found Laura gone, if he'd secured the documents and was even now working to cover his tracks, or flee, or do whatever desperate men did when their carefully constructed worlds began to collapse, they might already be too late. Only one way to find out, Evan said, opening the penthouse suite door and stepping into the hallway. The hotel around them was silent, except for the ambient sounds of the building, the HVAC system humming, pipes creaking, the distant ding of an elevator somewhere below. It was the dead hour of night, that stretch between 3 and 5 a.m., when even cities that never sleep take a shallow breath and rest. Laura and Catherine followed him to the elevator, the three of them crowding into the brass-lined car that smelled of expensive perfume and cleaning solution. As the elevator descended, Evan caught sight of their reflections in the polished doors, a room service waiter still in his vest and bow tie, a woman in a torn designer dress with ruined makeup, and a ghost who'd been invisible for 8 years now, stepping into the light. They looked like refugees from 3 different disasters who had found each other in the rubble. The elevator dinged at the 6th floor, and the doors opened onto the familiar corridor. Evan's abandoned tray still sat where he'd left it an hour ago, the food cold now, the wine probably warm. He'd have to deal with that later, would have to explain to his supervisor why he'd vanished for an hour, why room 607 never received their order. But those consequences seemed distant, almost trivial, compared to what was unfolding now. They approached room 706 cautiously, and Evan noticed that Laura was shaking, whether from cold or fear or adrenaline, he couldn't tell. The door was closed, no light visible beneath it, no sound from within. Laura pulled the keycard from her purse with trembling fingers and swiped it. The lock clicked green. She pushed the door open. The room was empty. More than empty, it looked ransacked. The briefcase was gone, as were the manila envelope and the scattered documents that had been on the desk. The dresser drawers hung open, contents rifled through. The closet door stood ajar, Laura's small suitcase overturned, clothes pulled out and discarded. Even the bathroom had been searched, toiletries knocked over, towels on the floor, the medicine cabinet hanging open. He came back, Laura said unnecessarily, her voice hollow. He took everything. Catherine pushed past her and did her own search, checking under the bed, in the nightstand drawers, even behind the heavy curtains. Not everything, she said finally, pulling something from behind the nightstand where it had fallen into the gap between furniture and wall. It was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a bank statement for an account Evan didn't recognize. Catherine scanned it quickly and then smiled, a sharp, fierce expression. This is from an offshore account, the Cayman Islands, if I'm reading this correctly. And look at the date. This statement is from last month. Joel must have printed it recently, and it fell when he was grabbing everything else. She handed it to Laura, who studied it with growing understanding. These deposits, Laura said, pointing to entries on the statement. They correspond to dates when Joel told me he was receiving bonuses from the firm. But this isn't a firm account. This is personal. He's been skimming. Not just skimming, Catherine said, pulling out her phone and photographing the documents from multiple angles. Joel's been using his position as trusted administrator to divert funds to his own accounts. Look at the amounts. They match distributions that were supposed to go to beneficiaries. He's been embezzling from the very trust he was supposed to be managing, stealing from your father's victims a second time. Evan felt disgust rise in his throat. It wasn't enough that Joel had helped Richard Harding cover up decades of crimes. It wasn't enough that he'd lied to Laura for 8 years and kept Catherine imprisoned in a luxury suite. He'd also been stealing from the people Richard had already destroyed, siphoning money that was meant as restitution, inadequate though it was, for his own enrichment. This changes the calculus, Laura said, and Evan heard something dangerous in her voice, something that sounded like fury refined into purpose. Joel isn't just an accomplice in my father's crimes. He's a criminal in his own right. And that means he's going to run, Catherine finished. When he realized you were serious about exposing everything, when he came back here and took these documents, he was preparing to disappear. He'll liquidate what he can, transfer funds offshore, and vanish before anyone can stop him. We have hours, maybe less. Laura pulled out her phone and pulled up her banking app with shaking fingers. Our joint accounts, she said, scrolling frantically. I need to check. Oh God, he's already started. Look, she turned the phone so Catherine and Evan could see. The account that had shown a balance of $43,000 when Laura had checked it earlier in the evening now showed $612. He drained it. While I was up in your suite, while we were talking, he was draining our accounts. What about your personal account? Evan asked. Do you have anything he can't access? A trust from my mother, Laura said, already navigating to another app. She set it up before she died. Wanted to make sure I'd always have something of my own. The balance is, she exhaled in relief. It's still there. 200,000. He doesn't have access to this one, and he can't get it without my signature. So I'm not completely broke. But everything else, everything we built together, he's taking it, Catherine said flatly. Of course he is. If he's going to run, he needs capital. And from his perspective, it's his money anyway. He's been managing the trust, doing the dirty work, keeping the secrets. Probably thinks he's earned it. Laura's phone buzzed with a text message, and Evan saw her face go pale as she read it. It's Joel, she said. He says, her voice caught. He says I made my choice and now he's making his. He says by the time I wake up tomorrow, he'll be gone. And if I try to come after him, he'll release information that will destroy not just my father's reputation, but mine too. He says he has evidence that I knew about the trust all along, that I was complicit, and that he'll use it to make sure I go to prison while he disappears. He's bluffing, Catherine said immediately. He can't have evidence of your knowledge because you didn't know, unless he fabricated something, which is possible. But it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny. It doesn't matter if it holds up, Laura said bitterly. The accusation alone would be enough. My name in the news, connected to fraud and embezzlement and corruption, I'd be destroyed socially and professionally, even if I was eventually exonerated. Joel knows that. He's threatening to burn me even as he runs. Evan thought about what Laura had said earlier, about choosing truth over comfortable lies, about being willing to lose everything for justice. That resolve was being tested now in real time, and he could see the fear in her eyes warring with determination. This was the moment when most people back down, when the reality of consequences overwhelmed the abstract appeal of doing the right thing. What do you want to do? Evan asked her quietly, giving her space to make her own choice without pressure. Laura was silent for a long moment, staring at her phone, at Joel's message with its implicit threat and explicit betrayal. Outside the window, the snow continued to fall, Chicago disappearing beneath whites that would be gray by noon. Finally she looked up, meeting Evan's eyes and then Catherine's, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. I want to finish what we started, she said. Joel can threaten whatever he wants. He can run, he can hide, he can try to take me down with him. But we have the bank statement from his offshore account. We have Catherine's files showing the full scope of my father's crimes and Joel's embezzlement. We have each other as witnesses, and in a few hours we'll have the contents of that safety deposit box. That's enough to build a case, enough to start the process of justice. So yes, let's do it. Let's call the lawyer at 8 a.m., get the documents at 9 a.m., and go to the FBI by noon. Joel might get a head start, but eventually they'll find him. Men like him always think they're cleverer than they are, and they always make mistakes. Catherine reached out and squeezed Laura's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity, and something that looked like pride. Okay, she said, then we need to spend the next few hours preparing. We should write down everything we know, create a timeline of events, anticipate what questions the FBI will ask. And Laura, she hesitated, you should think about what you're going to tell your friends, your colleagues, people who've known you as Richard Harding's daughter. This is going to be public, spectacularly public. Your life as you've known it ends today. I know, Laura said simply, and I'm ready. Or at least, I'm as ready as I'll ever be. They decided to return to Catherine's suite to work, the penthouse offering more space and privacy than the ransacked room 706. As they rode the elevator back up, Evan felt exhaustion creeping into his bones. He'd been awake for nearly 22 hours, and the adrenaline that had sustained him through this strange night was beginning to ebb. But there was no question of leaving now, not when they were so close to the precipice, not when Laura and Catherine needed every ally they could get. Back in the penthouse, Catherine made coffee strong, bitter stuff from an expensive espresso machine that she clearly knew how to operate with practiced ease. She handed mugs to Laura and Evan, and they settled around the dining table. Catherine's laptop opened between them, preparing for what came next. "We start with the money," Catherine said, pulling up her copied files. "That's what prosecutors care about most, following the money, proving financial crimes. So we need to document every fraudulent transaction, every payment from the trust, every instance of Richard's embezzlement and Joel's subsequent theft. Laura, do you have access to any of your father's old financial records? Things that might be in storage or in your mother's papers?" Laura thought for a moment. "There are boxes in my apartment, Joel's and mine in a storage unit in the basement. My mother's papers, my father's personal effects from his office. I never went through them after he died. Joel said he'd handle it as part of settling the estate, and I let him because I was grieving and I trusted him." The last words came out twisted with self-recrimination. "Don't," Evan said firmly, recognizing the spiral of self-blame that was starting. "Don't blame yourself for trusting your husband. That's what marriage is supposed to be, trust. Joel's the one who violated that, not you." Laura gave him a grateful look and sipped her coffee. "We'll need to get those boxes," she said to Catherine. "If they have any of my father's original financial records, they could corroborate what you found in Joel's files." "Can you access the storage unit without Joel?" Catherine asked. "It's in my name," Laura said. "The whole apartment is in my name, actually. I inherited it from my mother. Joel moved in when we got married, but legally, it's mine. So yes, I can access the storage unit. And honestly, I should probably go to the apartment before Joel does. Make sure he hasn't cleaned it out the way he cleaned out our bank accounts." "We should do that now," Evan said, checking his watch for 3:33 a.m. before he gets there. "Your apartment, where is it?" "Gold Coast," Laura said. "About 10 blocks from here, near Oak Street Beach. A 20-minute walk, maybe 5 minutes by cab, if we can find one in this weather." Catherine was already pulling up a rideshare app on her phone. "No cabs available because of the snow," she reported, "but the streets are still passable. If we're going to do this, we should go now, before Joel thinks to go back there." They bundled up Laura, borrowing a winter coat from Catherine's closet. The first time in 8 years that Catherine had shared anything from her invisible life with someone else. The coat fit reasonably well despite Catherine being thinner, and seeing Laura in it, Evan was struck again by their resemblance. The way they moved with similar grace, how their profiles echoed each other. The penthouse suite had a private elevator that opened directly into the lobby, bypassing the guest floors, a feature designed for celebrities and dignitaries who needed discretion. It was Evan's first time using it, and he felt distinctly out of place in the opulent car with its mahogany paneling and crystal light fixtures. When the doors opened onto the lobby, he instinctively tensed, expecting to see his supervisor or another staff member who would question what he was doing with 2 guests at 4:30 in the morning. But the lobby was nearly empty, just the night's security guard, Marcus, dozing at his post, and Dina at the front desk, her head bent over paperwork. Dina looked up as they crossed the marble floor toward the revolving doors, and Evan saw her eyes widen with recognition, then narrow with something that might have been concern or calculation. She knew Catherine by sight, of course. After 8 years of managing the woman's secret residence, how could she not? And she knew Evan, seeing them together, with Laura, who probably looked familiar from the society pages, had to be triggering alarms. "Everything all right?" Dina called out, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Fine," Evan called back, not slowing down, not giving her opportunity to ask more questions or delay them. "Just helping some guests." They pushed through the revolving doors into the pre-dawn cold, and Evan felt the shock of winter air hit his face like a slap. The temperature had dropped significantly since he'd started his shift, probably down into the teens, and the snow was coming down harder now, fat flakes that clung to their clothes and hair. The streets were deserted except for the occasional snowplow rumbling past, and the city felt suspended, caught between night and morning, between the old world and whatever came next. They walked quickly, heads down against the wind and snow, no one speaking. Laura led them east toward the lake and then north, navigating streets she'd probably walked hundreds of times in her previous life, when she'd been simply Richard Harding's daughter, wife of Joel Westfield, volunteer fundraiser for children's charities. How different those familiar blocks must look to her now, Evan thought. Every building and corner infused with new meaning, every memory tainted by the knowledge of what had been hidden. Laura's apartment building was exactly what Evan expected, a limestone high-rise with an Art Deco facade. A doorman standing behind glass doors, in a uniform that probably cost more than Evan's entire wardrobe, brass accents and marble floors visible through the windows. This was where people like Laura lived, people who'd never had to worry about rent or heat, or whether they could afford to eat and pay bills in the same month. The doorman recognized Laura immediately, his face shifting from bored neutrality to concern as he took in her appearance, the borrowed coat over the torn dress, the smeared makeup, the wild hair. "Mrs. Westfield," he said, opening the door for them. "Are you all right? Should I call someone?" "I'm fine, Marcus," Laura said, and Evan noted that she knew the doorman's name, that she spoke to him with warmth despite her distress. Maybe she'd been one of the good ones, the wealthy people who remembered that service workers were human. "These are my friends. We're just going up to the apartment." Marcus nodded, but his eyes lingered on Evan with the particular assessment that working-class people often gave each other, a quick evaluation of threat and trustworthiness. Evan met his gaze steadily, and after a moment, Marcus seemed to relax fractionally. "Mr. Westfield came through about an hour ago," he said to Laura. "He had luggage, 2 big suitcases. He said he was leaving for a business trip." Laura's face went carefully blank. "Did he say when he'd be back?" "No, ma'am." And Marcus hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to say more, and he seemed upset, angry. "I asked if everything was okay, and he told me to mind my own business, which isn't like him. So I just wanted you to know, in case you should be careful up there." "Thank you, Marcus," Laura said quietly. "I appreciate the warning." They took the elevator to the 14th floor, the ride silent and tense. When the doors opened, Laura led them down a hallway carpeted in deep blue, past doors marked with brass numbers, to Unit 1407. She unlocked it with shaking hands, and they stepped inside. The apartment was chaos. It looked like Joel had torn through it, the way he'd torn through room 706, but with more time and more desperation. Drawers hung open, their contents spilled onto the hardwood floors. Bookcases had been ransacked, volumes pulled out and tossed aside, as if Joel had been searching behind them for hidden documents. The kitchen showed evidence of hurried packing, cabinet doors open, some dishes missing, the espresso machine gone from the counter. But what stopped Evan cold was the wall in the living room. It had been covered with framed photographs, Laura and Joel at their wedding, on various vacations, at charity events, celebrating holidays. Every single frame was now face down on the floor, glass shattered, as if Joel had swept them off the wall in a fit of rage, or perhaps as a symbolic gesture, destroying the evidence of their shared life. Laura walked through the destruction with an eerie calm, as if she'd moved beyond shock into some territory where nothing could surprise her anymore. He took his clothes, she said, checking the bedroom closet, and his electronics, laptop, tablet, the external hard drive where he kept backups. He was thorough. The storage unit, Catherine reminded her. Your mother's papers. We need to check if he got to those. They took the elevator down to the basement, a utilitarian space with concrete floors and caged storage units assigned to each apartment. Laura's unit was at the far end, and as they approached, Evan felt his heart sink. The lock had been broken, the cage door hanging open, but when Laura stepped inside, she laughed, a genuine sound of relief. He didn't find them, she said, moving past stacked furniture and Christmas decorations to a corner where 3 large plastic bins sat untouched. He was looking for boxes. He probably searched for cardboard moving boxes and missed these completely because they looked like they contained seasonal decorations or household junk. She popped the lid off the first bin, and Evan saw it was packed with file folders. Their tabs, labeled in neat handwriting, tax returns, 1985 to 1990, corporate filings, property records, personal correspondence. It was an archive of Richard Harding's life and crimes, preserved by a widow who'd probably had no idea what she was keeping. We need to take all of these, Catherine said, and there was excitement in her voice now, the thrill of finally, after 8 years, having the means to strike back. Can we get them out of here without the doorman seeing? There's a service entrance, Laura said, loading dock around the corner. It opens onto the alley, and at this hour there shouldn't be anyone there. If we're quick, they were quick. The 3 of them working together managed to carry all 3 bins through the maze of the basement to the service elevator, then out through the loading dock into the alley, where snow was accumulating in drifts against dumpsters and parked delivery trucks. The cold bit through their clothes, and Evan's fingers went numb within minutes despite his trying to tuck them into his sleeves between carries. Where are we taking these? Evan asked as they stood in the alley, breath fogging in the frigid air. 3 bins at their feet, containing the evidence that could destroy or redeem multiple lives depending on how it was used. Back to the Drake, Catherine said, to my suite. It's the only place Joel can't access without causing a scene, and it has everything we need: Wi-Fi, a printer, scanner, space to work. We go back. We spend the next 3 hours going through these files and cross-referencing them with what I've already copied from Joel's computer. We build the case, and then at 8 a.m. we make our calls. They couldn't carry 3 large bins 10 blocks through a snowstorm, so Catherine pulled out her phone again and this time managed to get a rideshare driver, desperate or brave enough to be working in these conditions. The driver, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a car that smelled like cinnamon air freshener, took one look at the 3 of them, bedraggled, exhausted, carrying bins like refugees, and didn't ask a single question, just helped them load the plastic containers into a trunk and drove them carefully through snow-covered streets back to the Drake. The sun was beginning to lighten the eastern sky as they pulled up to the hotel's entrance, though the storm clouds meant it was more a gradual shift from black to grey than any real sunrise. Evan checked his phone, 6:17 a.m. His shift had officially ended 17 minutes ago, and he should have been on the bus home to his studio apartment, collapsing into bed for 6 hours of sleep before his next shift tonight. Instead, he was carrying bins of evidence into a luxury hotel with 2 women whose lives he'd become impossibly entangled with through a simple accident of reading a room number incorrectly. This time, when they crossed the lobby, Dina wasn't at the desk. The morning shift receptionist, a young guy named Andre, who Evan barely knew, gave them a curious look, but said nothing as they headed to the private elevator. Up in the penthouse suite, they spread out the contents of the 3 bins across the dining table, the coffee table, even the floor, creating a landscape of paper that documented 3 decades of Richard Harding's crimes. And there, as dawn broke over Chicago and the storm finally began to ease, the 3 of them worked. Laura and Catherine went through files while Evan, who had a good memory for numbers and patterns from his years of tracking inventory and orders in various service jobs, helped cross-reference bank statements with corporate filings. They found evidence of embezzlement going back to the early 1990s, discovered shell companies that existed only on paper, traced money flowing from legitimate construction budgets into offshore accounts. They found the evidence that Richard had manufactured against Thomas Kirby, discovered memos in Richard's own handwriting outlining how to alter financial records and create a paper trail implicating his employee. They found correspondence between Richard and Thomas from before the betrayal, letters that showed a genuine friendship that made Richard's subsequent actions even more monstrous. And they found evidence of Joel's embezzlement bank statements that matched the offshore account from the document they'd recovered in room 706, showing systematic theft over the past 3 years. Joel had started small, skimming a few thousand here and there, but had grown bolder, eventually siphoning hundreds of thousands from the trust that was supposed to compensate Richard's victims. At 7:45 a.m., Catherine finished compiling a summary document, a 20-page overview of the major crimes, with supporting documentation flagged and organized. At 7:52 a.m., Laura tried calling the Wells Fargo branch to confirm they could access the safety deposit box, but got only a recorded message saying the bank opened at 9 a.m. At 7:58 a.m., Evan pulled out the business card he'd retrieved from his locker during one of his trips through the Hotel Marcus Chun. Whistleblower defense and government fraud, a downtown address, and a phone number that Evan had never expected to call. At exactly 8 a.m., Evan dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered male. Young, alert, despite the early hour. Marcus Chun. Mr. Chun, Evan said, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and too much coffee. My name is Evan Hayes. We met 2 years ago at Mia Hayes's memorial service. You gave me your card and said if I ever needed legal help. I remember, Marcus said immediately, his tone shifting from professional to personal. Evan, yes, she was brilliant. I'm so sorry again for your loss. What do you need? I need help for someone else, Evan said. 2 women who were about to become whistleblowers in a major fraud case. Embezzlement, racketeering, corruption going back 30 years. Multiple victims, millions of dollars, connections to city officials and business leaders. They have evident, extensive documentation, and they want to go to the FBI, but they need protection, legal representation, someone who can make sure they're treated as cooperating witnesses and not as accomplices. There was a pause, and Evan heard the sound of Marcus moving, probably sitting up, his loyal brain engaging with the details. How major are we talking? Marcus asked. Richard Harding Development Corporation Major, Evan said, and heard Marcus's sharp intake of breath. One of the women is Richard Harding's daughter. The other is a victim of Harding's crimes, who's been paid for silence for 8 years. They have documentation of everything, original files, bank records, proof of embezzlement and fraud. And the situation is time-sensitive because the executor of Harding's estate, who's also the daughter's husband, realized he's been caught and is currently fleeing with whatever assets he can liquidate. Jesus, Marcus breathed. Okay, where are you right now? The Drake Hotel, Penthouse Suite 2. Can you come here? I can be there in 20 minutes, Marcus said. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't hand over any documents. Don't make any statements until I get there. And, Evan, thank you for calling me. Mia would be glad you remembered." The call ended, and Evan looked at Laura and Catherine, who had been listening intently. "He's coming," Evan said. "We wait for him, and then we move forward together." Those 20 minutes felt like hours. They used the time to organize the evidence into categories, to prepare statements of what each of them knew and when they'd learnt it. Catherine wrote out her history with Richard Harding, documented her 8 years in the penthouse, detailed every interaction with Joel. Laura compiled a timeline of her marriage, noting instances where Joel had been evasive or where money had gone missing. Evan wrote a simple account of how he'd opened the wrong door and what he'd witnessed since, positioning himself as a bystander who'd become involved out of concern for a guest's welfare. At 8:19 a.m., the suite's doorbell rang. Apparently, even penthouse suites had doorbells, Evan thought absurdly. Catherine opened it to reveal an Asian man in his early 30s, wearing a suit that looked hastily thrown on, his tie slightly crooked, his hair damp from a quick shower. He was carrying a leather briefcase and had the alert, intense expression of someone running on adrenaline and purpose. "Marcus Chen," he said, stepping inside and taking in the scene. The papers everywhere, the 3 exhausted people, the weight of crisis hanging in the air. His eyes found Evan, and something softened. "It's good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Now," he set his briefcase down and pulled out a legal pad. "Tell me everything." They did. For the next 40 minutes, the 3 of them walked Marcus Chun through the entire story: Richard's crimes, Catherine's captivity, Joel's betrayal and theft, the evidence they'd gathered, their plan to access the safety deposit box. Marcus listened without interrupting, his pen moving rapidly across the legal pad, his expression growing more serious with each revelation. When they finished, he sat back and let out a long breath. "This is ... double quotes." He paused, searching for words. "This is potentially the biggest white-collar criminal case in Chicago in the last decade. If even half of what you're telling me is true and can be proven, we're looking at LICO charges, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, the list goes on. The Drake Hotel could be implicated as an accessory if we can prove management knew about and facilitated the scheme. Multiple city officials will probably be caught up in it. This is going to explode. Can you help us?" Laura asked quietly. Marcus met her eyes. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "But you need to understand what you're signing up for. This process will take years. You'll be deposed, investigated, possibly put on trial if prosecutors think you knew more than you claim. Your personal life will be dissected. Every financial transaction, every relationship, every decision you've made will be questioned. The media will be brutal. And Miss Kirby," he turned to Catherine, "your situation is complicated. You've been accepting what you knew were probably illegal payments for 8 years. A good defense attorney could argue you were complicit, that you benefited from Richard Harding's crimes." "I know," Catherine said steadily, "but I want to do it anyway. I want my father's name cleared. I want the truth on record. Whatever it costs me personally is worth that." Marcus nodded, respect evident in his expression. "Okay, then here's what we do. First, we need to secure that safety deposit box before Joel can access it or claim the contents." "Laura, you said you're a beneficiary of your father's estate." "Yes," Laura confirmed. "I inherited 1/3 of it, with the other 2/3 held in trust for potential grandchildren. Joel is the executor and trustee." "Good," Marcus said. "That gives you standing. We go to the bank at 9 a.m. and you request access to the box as a beneficiary who has concerns about the executor's management of estate assets. Illinois law allows beneficiaries to examine estate property if there's evidence of mismanagement, which we definitely have. He gestured to the offshore bank statement. We document everything in the box, photograph it, and remove originals that prove criminal activity. Then, we immediately contact the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and request a meeting. I'll reach out to a contact I have there, an agent named Sarah Reeves, who specializes in financial crimes. She's tough, but fair, and she'll listen. What about Joel? Laura asked. He's running. By the time the FBI gets involved, he could be in a country without extradition. Let him run, Marcus said. Flight is consciousness of guilt. It actually helps our case and hurts his. The FBI has resources for tracking fugitives, especially ones who need to access money. Joel can't disappear completely unless he's willing to live in poverty, and men like him never are. He'll surface eventually, and when he does, they'll grab him. He checked his watch. 8:47 a.m. We need to move. The bank opens in 13 minutes, and we want to be there right when they unlock the doors, before Joel thinks to try the same thing. Catherine, you should stay here. If this goes wrong, if we're arrested or detained, someone needs to be free to contact other lawyers or media if necessary. Can you do that? Yes, Catherine said. I've been trapped in this hotel for 8 years. A few more hours won't kill me. And she looked at Laura with eyes that held both fear and hope. I'll be here when you get back. I'm not going anywhere. Not anymore. The sisters hugged, a fierce, clinging embrace of people who'd just found each other and were terrified of being separated again. Then Laura, Evan, and Marcus headed down to the lobby, out through the revolving doors, into a Chicago morning where the storm had passed and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. The Wells Fargo branch on Michigan Avenue was only 3 blocks away, and they walked quickly, arriving at 8:56 a.m. A security guard was unlocking the doors as they approached, and they slipped inside, along with a handful of other early customers, people who needed to handle banking before work, who probably had no idea they were standing in line behind people carrying evidence of one of Chicago's biggest financial scandals. Laura approached the first available bank representative, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the patient expression of someone who'd heard every banking problem imaginable. Good morning, Laura said, and her voice was admirably steady. My name is Laura Westfield, nee Harding. I am a beneficiary of my late father Richard Harding's estate, and I need to access his safety deposit box. I have concerns about how the executor is managing estate assets, and I need to examine the box's contents. The bank representative's expression shifted to concern. Do you have identification and documentation of your status as beneficiary? Laura pulled out of a driver's license and a copy of Richard's will that she'd found in one of the bins from her apartment storage. Marcus added his business card and a brief letter he'd written during their walkover, outlining the legal basis for Laura's request. The representative examined everything carefully, then excused herself to consult with a manager. 5 minutes past 10. Evan's nerves were fraying, wondering if Joel had somehow gotten here first, if he'd already cleaned out the box, if they were too late. But finally the representative returned with a man in a suit who introduced himself as the branch manager. Mrs. Westfield, he said, I've reviewed your request and consulted with our legal department. As a direct beneficiary of the estate, you do have standing to access the safety deposit box, particularly if you have concerns about executor mismanagement. However, I need to inform you that the executor, Joel Westfield, was here last night at 9:47 p.m., shortly before we closed. He accessed the box and spent approximately 20 minutes in the private viewing room. Laura's face went white. Did he remove anything? I can't say without examining the box, the manager said, but I can tell you that when he left, he was carrying a manila envelope that he didn't have when he arrived. I noticed because it was unusual for someone to come so late and seem so ... agitated. Please, Laura said, and there was desperation in her voice now. Please let me see what's left. If he's taken evidence of crimes, if he's destroyed documents, right this way, the manager said, his expression softening with what might have been sympathy or simply the desire to avoid a scene in his bank lobby. They followed him through a heavy door into the vault, a room lined with safety deposit boxes in various sizes. The manager located box 847, inserted the bank's master key, and then handed Laura a second key that had been in her mother's papers. Together, they turned the keys and the box slid free. It was large, one of the bigger sizes, and it was heavy, but not as heavy as it should have been. The manager led them to a private viewing room, a small space with just a table and chairs, and left them alone with the box. Laura lifted the lid with shaking hands. The box was perhaps a third full. There were several file folders, a few USB drives, some old photographs. But it was clear from the disarray, from the way papers had been shoved back carelessly, that much had been removed. He took the most damning stuff, Laura said, her voice hollow. Of course he did. He knew I'd come here eventually, and he got here first. But Marcus was already spreading out what remained, his lawyer's eyes scanning documents rapidly. He didn't get everything, he said, a note of excitement creeping into his voice. Look, these are original contracts between Richard Harding and city officials, dated from the early 1990s. They outline payments for favorable zoning decisions, for overlooking building code violations. And this, he held up a USB drive. This is labeled Insurance Final. If it's what I think it is, it's Richard's complete documentation of his crimes, his leverage against everyone he'd implicated. Joel probably didn't think to check the drives, or he ran out of time. Evan, meanwhile, had found something else, a handwritten letter, several pages, the paper yellowed with age. This is from Thomas Kirby, he said quietly. It's addressed to Richard Harding. Listen, Richard, I'm writing this the night before I go to trial, when I still foolishly believe that somehow the truth will come out, that somehow justice will prevail. I know you framed me. I know you're the one who stole from the company, who bribed the inspectors, who falsified the records. I know it, and you know it. But I also know that no one will believe me, a simple project manager, against Chicago's most respected developer. So I'm writing this not for me, but for my daughter Catherine. Someday, when she's older, when she's able to understand, I want her to have this letter so she knows her father wasn't a criminal, wasn't a thief, wasn't what they're going to say I am at trial. I was a man who tried to do the right thing and was destroyed for it. And Richard, if you're reading this after I'm gone, if my daughter has somehow found a way to bring this letter to light, then you should know that I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I don't want to die carrying hate. But I pray that someday, somehow, the truth comes out, for Catherine's sake, so she doesn't have to carry the shame of my conviction for the rest of her life. The room was silent except for the sound of Laura crying deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place beyond simple grief, from the recognition of pain that mirrored her own, from the understanding that her father had not just destroyed lives, but had known exactly what he was doing and had done it anyway. We need to take this to Catherine, Laura said when she could speak again. She needs to see this. She needs to know her father was thinking of her, that he died hoping she'd be free of his legacy. Marcus was carefully photographing every document, every USB drive, every scrap of paper in the box with his phone, creating a digital backup in case anything happened to the originals. We take copies, he said, but the originals stay here for now, secured in the box with a notation that they're potential evidence in an ongoing investigation. That creates a legal chain of custody, and prevents anyone from claiming we tampered with them. They spent another 20 minutes documenting everything, with the bank manager acting as witness and signing a statement that confirmed the box's contents as of 9:42 a.m. on this date. Then they left the bank, stepping back out into the cold Chicago morning, carrying USB drives and photocopies that could topple an empire. Back at the Drake, Catherine was pacing the penthouse suite like a caged animal when they entered. "What happened?" she demanded. "Did you get it?" "Joel, he got there first," Laura said. "He took a lot, but not everything." "Catherine." She handed her half-sister the letter from Thomas Kirby. Catherine read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed her father's words from beyond the grave. When she finished, she clutched the letter to her chest and sank onto the sofa, crying with a ferocity that shook her entire body. "He forgave him," she whispered. "After everything Richard did, my dad forgave him. How is that possible?" "Because he was a better man than Richard Harding could ever be," Laura said, sitting beside Catherine and pulling her into an embrace. "And because he loved you enough to want to free you from bitterness." Marcus gave the sisters space for their grief, while he and Evan loaded the USB drives into Catherine's laptop. What they found confirmed everything and more. Richard Harding's insurance policy was exhaustive, documenting not just his own crimes, but those of dozens of accomplices. There were detailed records of bribes paid to aldermen, city inspectors, and zoning board members. There were contracts for buildings that had been erected without proper permits or safety measures, some of which had resulted in injuries or deaths to construction workers. There were accounts of fraud against investors, embezzlement from pension funds, and money laundering through shell corporations. And there, in a file labeled Contingencies, they found Richard's instructions to Joel, written directions for maintaining the payments to Catherine and the other victims, guidelines for managing the trust, and explicit threats about what would happen to Joel's career and freedom if he ever revealed the truth. Richard had implicated Joel deliberately, had made him an accomplice as insurance that Joel would never turn against the family he'd married into. "This is enough," Marcus said finally. "This is more than enough to build a massive case. The question now is how we deliver it. I can call Agent Reeves, but I want you all to understand what happens the moment I make that call. The FBI will move fast. They'll seize records, freeze accounts, start interviewing witnesses. Your lives will be under a microscope. Laura, you'll be questioned extensively. Catherine, you'll need to be prepared for the possibility of charges against you before they offer immunity. Evan," he looked at the room service waiter who had accidentally become the catalyst for all of this, "you're probably in the clear legally, but you'll be a witness in a major federal case. Your testimony about what you saw and heard tonight could be crucial." "I'm ready," Evan said simply. "So am I," Catherine echoed. "And so am I," Laura finished. Marcus made the call. Agent Sarah Reeves arrived at the Drake at 11:37 a.m., accompanied by 3 other FBI agents and a prosecutor from the U.S. Attorney's Office. They set up in the penthouse suite, transforming Catherine's living space into an impromptu command center. For the next 6 hours, Laura, Catherine, and Evan gave statements, turned over evidence, answered thousands of questions. The USB drives were copied, the documents catalogued, the bank statements examined. By 6 p.m., arrest warrants had been issued for Joel Westfield, who was officially classified as a fugitive. By 8 p.m., search warrants were being executed at Joel's law firm, at Laura's apartment, at Richard Harding's old offices. By midnight, the story had broken in the Chicago Tribune and on every local news station. Harding development scandal exposed decades of fraud uncovered, and through it all, Laura and Catherine stayed together, two sisters united by blood and trauma, and the courage to finally speak truth to power. 3 months later, Joel Westfield was arrested in Panama City, trying to access one of his offshore accounts. He was extradited to face 63 federal charges. He would eventually plead guilty to 37 counts in exchange for testimony against other conspirators in Richard Harding's schemes. The Drake Hotel faced investigations into its role in sheltering Catherine and facilitating the payment scheme. Dina, the front desk manager, and 2 other senior staff members were charged with conspiracy and received probation in exchange for cooperation. Catherine Kirby's father, Thomas, was posthumously exonerated, his conviction overturned based on the evidence of Richard Harding's frame-up. A memorial was erected in his honor at the construction site where he'd worked for 2 decades. And Laura Westfield, née Harding, made a decision that surprised everyone except those who had been with her that long night in the Drake. Using funds recovered from the fraudulent trust money that prosecutors determined belonged to the victims and their families, Laura established the Thomas Kirby Foundation. Its mission to provide college scholarships and vocational training to children of working-class families in Chicago, with priority given to children of hotel and service workers who so often remained invisible to those they served. The first scholarship recipient was Evan Hayes, who used it to enroll in a social work program at DePaul University, determined to help others navigate the kind of trauma and loss he'd endured. On a cool morning in early May, as spring finally broke through Chicago's brutal winter, Laura stood in the lobby of the Drake Hotel for what she knew would be the last time. The hotel had new management, a new policy about long-term residents, a new commitment to transparency. Catherine had moved out of the penthouse suite 3 weeks earlier into a modest but comfortable apartment in Witter Park that she'd chosen herself, paid for with honest work she'd found managing a non-profit's financial system skills she'd developed during 8 years of isolation, now put to better use. Laura ran her hand along the brass railing of the revolving door, remembering the night everything had changed. The night a waiter had opened the wrong door and given her the truth she'd never asked for but desperately needed. Then she stepped through the door into bright sunlight, into a world where her name was no longer associated with wealth and privilege, but with justice and redemption, and she smiled, because sometimes, when everything falls apart, the pieces rearrange into something better than what came before. Sometimes the truth hurts so badly that the only way to survive is to transform the pain into purpose. And sometimes a mistake, a wrong door opened, a number misread, becomes the beginning of freedom. Behind her, the Drake Hotel stood golden and gleaming in the morning light, its secrets finally exposed, its shadows finally brought into daylight. And in countless homes across Chicago, children of housekeepers and bellhops and night clerks and room service waiters opened envelopes with the Thomas Kirby Foundation seal, read letters that began congratulations, and understood that someone, somewhere, saw them, really saw them, and believed their lives had value. Their dreams had worth. Their invisible labor deserved recognition. Laura walked away from the Drake with her head held high, her phone buzzing with a text from Catherine. "Coffee at our place. I made your favorite." They place. The apartment they decided to share when Catherine got her footing in the world and Laura rebuilt her life from honesty rather than inheritance. Two sisters, strangers no longer, building something new from the wreckage of what their father had destroyed. And somewhere in a DePaul University classroom, Evan Hayes took notes on trauma-informed care, his worn Timex still ticking on his wrist. His sister Mia's memory, a weight he carried with something that now felt like peace rather than pain, knowing that her death had not been meaningless, that the promise he'd made at her grave to show up, to stay, to help, had been kept in ways he'd never imagined. The story could have ended differently. Laura could have chosen comfort over truth, could have protected her inheritance at the cost of her integrity. Catherine could have stayed silent, could have accepted her comfortable cage. Evan could have walked away when he realized he'd opened the wrong door, could have chosen safety over solidarity. But they hadn't. And that choice, the choice to be brave when it would have been easier to be cowardly, to be honest when it would have been simpler to lie, to sacrifice comfort for justice, that choice changed everything, not just for them, but for every person touched by Richard Harding's crimes, every family torn apart by his greed, every dream deferred by his selfishness. The ripples spread outward, touching lives they'd never meet, creating possibilities they'd never see, planting seeds of hope in soil that had been salted with despair. And if you've ever wondered whether one person's courage can make a difference, whether speaking truth can overcome powerful lies, whether justice delayed can still be justice delivered, then know this: it can, it does, it will. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in our darkest moments we have the power to choose truth over please leave a comment sharing which moment resonated most deeply with your own life. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about ordinary people finding extraordinary courage in impossible situations. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that sometimes the wrong door leads to the right path, and that it's never too late to stand up for what's right, no matter what it costs. Because in the end, the only thing more expensive than truth is the price we pay for living a lie. Agent Sarah Reeves arrived at the Drake Hotel at 11:34 a.m. with 3 other FBI agents, and the kind of focused intensity that made the air in the Pendal suite feel suddenly charged with official consequence. She was in her early 40s, Evan guessed, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, sharp eyes that missed nothing, and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every variation of criminal behavior humanity could produce, and was unimpressed by all of it. "Mr. Chun," she said, shaking Marcus's hand, "when you said you had something significant, I didn't realize you meant potentially the biggest corruption case in Chicago since Operation Greylord." Her eyes swept across Laura. "Catherine and Evan, I'm going to need statements from each of you. Detailed, comprehensive statements. And I'm going to need to secure all the evidence you've mentioned, the physical documents, the USB drives, the laptop with the copied files. This needs to be done by the book, or a defense attorney will tear it apart in court." What followed were 6 of the most grueling hours Evan had ever experienced. Each of them was interviewed separately, their stories recorded and cross-referenced, their timelines examined for inconsistencies. FBI forensic accountants arrived to begin preliminary examination of the financial documents. A digital forensics specialist took possession of Catherine's laptop and the USB drives from the safety deposit box, promising to create verified copies while maintaining chain of custody. Laura was questioned for nearly 3 hours about her relationship with Joel, about what she'd known and when she'd known it, about her father's business dealings. Evan could hear her voice through the closed bedroom door where they'd taken her, could hear the controlled emotion as she answered the same questions multiple times in slightly different formulations. The FBI's way of testing for lies or rehearsed responses. Catherine's interview was even longer, 4 hours, as agents tried to determine whether she'd been a victim or an accomplice, whether her 8 years in the penthouse constituted coercion or complicity. Evan heard raised voices at one point, heard Catherine insisting fiercely that she'd been trapped, that accepting Richard Harding's money hadn't been a choice but the only option for survival. When it was Evan's turn, Agent Reeves looked at him with something that might have been curiosity. "You're the wild card in all this," she said. "The room service waiter who opened the wrong door." "That's an incredible coincidence, Mr. Hayes. Almost too incredible." "I know how it sounds," Evans said, meeting her gaze steadily. "But I can't change the truth just to make it more believable. I misread the room number. I opened 706 instead of 607. I found Mrs. Westfield on the floor, and I made a choice to stay and help her. Everything that came after meeting Catherine, discovering the documents, going to the bank, that all followed from that one wrong door." "Why did you stay?" Reeves asked, leaning forward. "You could have backed out, apologized, reported it to your supervisor. Why get involved in a guest's personal crisis?" So Evan told her about Mia, about the phone call in the snowstorm, about choosing his job over his sister, about the promise he'd made at her grave that he would never again walk away from someone who needed help. He watched Reeves's expression shift slightly as he spoke, saw something soften in her eyes, and realized that even FBI agents were human, that they understood loss and guilt and the desperate need to make meaning from tragedy. By the time all the interviews were complete, it was nearly 6 p.m. The winter darkness had already fallen outside, and Evan realized with a strange sense of disconnection that he'd been awake for nearly 40 hours straight. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, moving through space on autopilot, while his mind struggled to process everything that had happened since he'd picked up that room service tray in what felt like another lifetime. Agent Reeves gathered them all in the penthouse living room. "Here's where we are," she said. "We have enough evidence to open a full investigation into Richard Harding's criminal enterprise, the trust that was used to pay off victims, and Joel Westfield's embezzlement and subsequent flight. We're issuing a warrant for Joel's arrest on charges of wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice. We're also beginning the process of identifying and interviewing the other beneficiaries of the trust, the victims and their families who were paid for silence." "What about us?" Laura asked. "Catherine and me. Are we being charged?" "Not at this time," Reeves said carefully. "Mrs. Westfield, our investigation indicates you had no knowledge of your father's crimes or your husband's management of the illegal trust. You're a victim in this scenario, not a perpetrator. Miss Kirby," she turned to Catherine, "your situation is more complicated. You knowingly accepted payments that originated from criminal activity. However, given the circumstances, your father's wrongful conviction, your vulnerable position when Richard Harding first approached you, and the coercive nature of the arrangement were inclined to view you as a victim as well. Additionally, your cooperation in providing evidence is substantial. I can't make promises, but I would be very surprised if the U.S. Attorney's Office chose to pursue charges against you." Catherine's relief was visible, her shoulders dropping as if her physical weight had been lifted. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you wait," Reeves said. "We continue our investigation. We track Joel Westfield and Mrs. Westfield. I should tell you that we've already frozen all accounts we can identify as potentially containing embezzled funds, so his access to resources is limited. We'll find him. It might take weeks or months, but we'll find him. In the meantime, you all need to be prepared for media attention. Once we start issuing subpoenas and search warrants, word will get out. The Harding name is prominent in Chicago. This will be front-page news." "Good," Laura said quietly. "Let it be news. Let everyone know what my father really was. The truth has been buried long enough." As the FBI agents packed up their equipment and evidence, as Agent Reeves gave them contact information and instructions for what to do if Joel tried to reach out, Evan felt the enormity of what they'd set in motion, settling over him like snow accumulating on a roof, silent, gradual, but with the potential to collapse everything beneath its weight. The agents left around 7 p.m., and suddenly the three of them were alone again in the penthouse suite that had been Catherine's prison for 8 years, but was now becoming something else, a command center maybe, or a refuge, or simply the place where three unlikely allies had forged a bond through crises. "I need to go home," Evan said, exhaustion finally overwhelming him. "I need to sleep. I need to." He laughed weakly. "I need to probably call my supervisor and explain why I abandoned a room service order and disappeared for an entire shift. I'm probably fired." "You're not fired," Laura said firmly. "I'll make sure of that. I'll talk to the hotel management, explain that you were helping me during an emergency. They won't fire you. Laura, you might not have as much influence with hotel management as you think," Catherine said gently. "Once the investigation goes public, once it comes out that the Drake was complicit in maintaining my father's hush money scheme, this hotel is going to be trying to distance itself from anything Harding related. Your name might be more liability than asset." Laura's face fell as she absorbed this truth. "Right," she said. "Of course. I'm not Richard Harding's daughter anymore, not in the way I was. I'm the daughter who exposed him. That's different. That's better," Evan said with conviction. "You're the daughter who chose truth over comfort. That's infinitely better." They exchanged phone numbers, made plans to stay in touch, and Evan finally left the penthouse suite and took the elevator down to the lobby. It was now past 7 p.m., and the hotel was busy with guests checking in for evening events, with the restaurant filling up for dinner service, with all the normal activity of a luxury hotel that had no idea it was about to be swept up in a federal investigation. Evan stopped by his supervisor's office, prepared to grovel or explain or simply accept termination, but his supervisor, a perpetually stressed man named Robert, who had worked at the Drake for 23 years, just looked at him with tired eyes and said, "Dina told me you were helping a guest in distress, but you stayed with her all night. That's above and beyond, Hayes. Take tomorrow off. You look like death." Evan wanted to laugh at the profound understatement of helping a guest in distress, but he just nodded and headed to the employee locker room to collect his things. As he was changing out of his vest and bow tie, Dina appeared in the doorway. "Evan," she said, and her voice carried a warning. "I don't know what you got involved in with those women, but I saw FBI agents in the hotel today. I saw them going up to the penthouse, and I need you to understand something. There are things at this hotel that have been a certain way for a very long time, things that people depend on. If you've done something to upset that balance, those things were wrong, Dina," Evan said, meeting her eyes. "The payments you were receiving to keep Catherine Kirby hidden, to help maintain Richard Harding's cover, that was blood money. People were hurt, lives were destroyed, and you helped keep it quiet for a paycheck." Dina's face hardened. "You have no idea what it's like to work for 30 years in a place like this, watching rich people treat you like furniture, barely making enough to support a family. When someone offers you $5,000 a month just to mind your own business, just to not ask questions about a guest who wants privacy, you take it. You take it because it means your daughter can go to college, because it means you can finally fix the roof on your house, because it means security in a world that offers working people damn little of it." "I know," Evan said, and he did. He understood the impossible choices poverty forced on people, understood the way financial desperation could erode moral certainty. But Dina, the money Richard Harding used to pay you was stolen, from pension funds, from workers, from people like us. He destroyed Catherine. Kirby's father sent an innocent man to prison and let him die there, and then paid people like you to help him hide his victim. That's not just minding your own business. That's being part of something rotten. Dinah looked at him for a long moment, and Evans saw conflict warring in her expression, anger and defensiveness, and perhaps, beneath it all, shame. "The FBI is going to come for me," she said finally. "Aren't they?" "Probably," Evans said, not unkindly. "But Dinah, if you cooperate, if you tell them everything you know about how the arrangement worked, about who else at the hotel was involved, that cooperation might be enough to keep you out of prison." Marcus Chun, the lawyer who's representing Laura and Catherine, he handles whistleblower cases. He might be able to help you too. He wrote down Marcus's contact information and handed it to her. Dinah took it with shaking hands, and Evans saw that she was crying quiet tears that spoke of her life about to come apart, of choices made years ago that were finally extracting their price. Evan left the Drake at 7:43 p.m. and caught a bus heading south toward his apartment. The city slid past the windows, lights and people, and the endless churn of Chicago. Life, and he felt strangely disconnected from all of it, as if he'd been living in an alternate reality for the past 24 hours, and was now returning to the regular world as a fundamentally different person. He slept for 14 hours straight, dreamless and deep. When he woke, it was 10 a.m. the following day, and his phone showed 17 missed calls and 32 text messages. Most were from Marcus Chun, providing updates. The FBI had executed search warrants at Jola's law office and had seized extensive files. The U.S. Attorney's Office was convening a grand jury. Media outlets were starting to pick up the story. The Chicago Tribune had just posted an article titled, "Harding Development Heir Cooperates in Federal Fraud Investigation." There was also a text from Laura. "Thank you doesn't cover it. You changed my life by opening the wrong door. I'll never forget that." And one from Catherine. "The FBI is letting me leave the hotel. For the first time in 8 years, I can go anywhere I want. I'm terrified and exhilarated, and I don't know what to do first. Maybe get coffee somewhere other than this suite. Would you and Laura want to meet?" Evans smiled and texted back yes to Catherine, then dragged himself to the shower. As hot water sloughed away the exhaustion and grime of the past 2 days, he thought about doors, about the ones we choose to open, the ones we walk through by accident, the ones we're too afraid to even approach. He'd opened the wrong door, and it had led him into the middle of other people's catastrophe. But somehow, impossibly, that wrong door had also led to something right, to truth being spoken, to justice beginning its slow grind forward, to 3 people finding connection in the wreckage. The next several weeks were a whirlwind. The story exploded across Chicago media and the national news. Richard Harding's empire was dissected in newspaper articles and cable news segments. The FBI's investigation expanded to include not just the original crimes, but also the dozens of people who'd been paid to keep quiet, creating a cascade of revelations as victims came forward with their stories. Joel Westfield was arrested 3 weeks later in Costa Rica, trying to board a flight to a non-extradition country. He'd burned through most of his accessible funds and had made the amateur mistake of using a credit card at a hotel, allowing the FBI to track him. He was extradited, charged with 16 federal crimes, and denied bail as a flight risk. The Drake Hotel faced its own reckoning. Several members of senior management, including the general manager, resigned or were terminated. Dinah took Evans' advice and reached out to Marcus Chun, who negotiated an immunity deal in exchange for her testimony about the hotel's role in concealing Catherine. She kept her job, barely, though the $5,000 monthly payments stopped, and Evan heard through the workplace grapevine that she'd had to take a second job to make up for the lost income. Laura filed for divorce, and publicly renounced her inheritance from Richard Harding's estate, a decision that made headlines and sparked fierce debate about whether children should be held accountable for their parents' crimes. She moved out of the Gold Coast apartment and into a modest 2-bedroom in Wicker Park, taking with her only what she'd brought to the marriage and what her mother had left her. Catherine began the slow, difficult process of building a life outside the penthouse. With the FBI's blessing, she moved to a regular apartment, started therapy, and enrolled in community college classes. The education her father's imprisonment had stolen from her, now finally within reach. And Evan continued working at the Drake, though the hotel felt different now, haunted by the revelation of secrets that had been hidden in plain sight for so long. But he also felt different, more confident somehow, more certain that the choices he made mattered, that opening doors, even wrong ones, could change lives. 3 months after that night, on a cold afternoon in early spring, when Chicago was just beginning to thaw from winter's grip, Evan received a call from Marcus Chun. "Evan, you need to come to my office," Marcus said, his voice carrying barely contained excitement. "Laura and Catherine are here, and we have news. Big news." Evan took the L downtown and walked to Marcus's office in a sleek high-rise near the river. In the conference room, Laura and Catherine sat side by side, sisters now not just in blood, but in bearing, both of them looking healthier and more grounded than they had that desperate night in February. "What's the news?" Evan asked, taking a seat across from them. Laura smiled, a genuine, full smile that transformed her face. "The federal government has recovered $43 million from the various accounts Richard used to hide his stolen funds. The courts have ruled that after restitution is paid to the original victims, the remainder goes into a fund that Laura and I, as Richard's heirs, have input on how it's distributed." "We can't keep it," Catherine added. "Neither of us wants anything that came from Richard's crimes. But we can direct where it goes. And we've made a decision." Marcus slid a document across the table to Evan. "They're creating the Thomas Kirby Memorial Foundation," he said, "named after Catherine's father. The foundation will provide college scholarships and vocational training to children of wrongfully convicted parents and to workers in service industries who want to pursue education. And they're endowing it with $20 million. Evan stared at the document, unable to process the magnitude of what he was hearing. $20 million, a fortune that would change countless lives, that would give opportunities to people who'd been written off by society, who'd been invisible the way service workers like him were so often invisible. "There's more," Laura said gently. "One of the foundation's first initiatives is going to be a partnership with the Drake Hotel. We're requiring them, as part of their settlement with the FBI, to provide paid educational leave for any employee who wants to pursue a degree or certification, full tuition coverage, plus continued salary during class time. The hotel is calling it the Second Chance Program." Catherine leaned forward, her eyes bright. "Evan, you opened the wrong door and gave us a chance to make things right. Now, we're opening the door for you and every other person who works in service, who's told themselves they can't afford to dream bigger. You can go back to school. You can study whatever you want. The foundation will pay for it, and the Drake will give you the time to do it." Evan felt his throat constrict with emotion. He thought about all the times he'd walked past Northwestern's campus, where Mia had studied, and wondered what his life might have been if he'd had the chance to go to college instead of straight to work at 17. He thought about the dreams he'd buried under the necessity of survival, the possibilities he'd convinced himself were for other people, people who didn't have to count every dollar and choose between ambition and eating. "I don't know what to say," he managed. "Say yes," Laura told him. "Say you'll apply. Say you'll let us give back even a fraction of what you gave us that night." So Evan said yes. He applied to Northwestern's evening program in social work, wanting to formalize the impulse that had made him stay in room 706, to learn how to help people in crises in ways that went beyond simple presence. He was accepted for the fall semester, with full tuition covered by the Thomas Kirby Memorial Foundation and a work schedule at the Drake that accommodated his classes. Laura went back to school too, enrolling in a law program focused on criminal justice reform and wrongful convictions. She wanted to help people like Thomas Kirby, wanted to use her privilege and resources to fight for those who'd been destroyed by systems designed to protect the powerful. Catherine finally finished the bachelor's degree her father's imprisonment had interrupted, graduating with honors in social work. She and Laura, half-sisters who'd been kept apart for decades by lies and money, became not just family but partners, working together at the foundation, giving purpose to pain. Joel Westfield was convicted on 14 of 16 charges and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, both Laura and Catherine gave victim impact statements, and Evan sat in the gallery watching as the man who'd thought he could manage other people's lives like assets was finally held accountable. But the moment that stayed with Evan, the one he would remember years later when he'd finished his degree and was working as a social worker helping homeless youth on Chicago's South Side, happened on a June evening 6 months after that wrong door had changed everything. He was walking past the Drake, now just a visitor rather than an employee, having left his position there to focus on school, and he saw Laura and Catherine standing on the sidewalk, looking up at the hotel's ornate facade with expressions that held complexity, pain and triumph, memory and release. "We're saying goodbye," Laura explained when Evan approached. "The FBI investigation is mostly complete. The hotel is under new management. Our father's name has been officially cleared from the record, and Thomas Kirby has been posthumously exonerated. And Catherine," she looked at her sister with fierce pride, "Catherine is moving to Seattle, starting completely fresh, somewhere that doesn't have any connection to Richard or Joel or any of it, but you'll visit," Catherine said to Laura, and it was clear this had been discussed, negotiated, worried over. "All the time," Laura promised. "We just found each other. I'm not losing you again." They stood together in the early summer evening, three people whose lives had collided through accident and been forever altered by the choices they'd made in the hours that followed. The Drake's famous revolving door spun slowly, guests entering and exiting, oblivious to the history that had unfolded in room 706 and in the penthouse suite, oblivious to the lives that had been shattered and rebuilt within those walls. "I'm glad you opened the wrong door," Catherine said to Evan, and there was wonder in her voice, as if she still couldn't quite believe how one small mistake had cascaded into liberation. "So am I," Evan said, meaning it with his whole heart. They walked together to a nearby coffee shop, the kind of ordinary activity that Catherine had been denied for 8 years, that Laura was still learning to do without the cushion of her father's wealth and name, that Evan had always known but now appreciated with new depth. They sat for hours, talking and laughing and planning futures that felt wide open in ways none of them had imagined possible that desperate February night. As the sun set over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reflected off the lake and turned the whole city golden, Evan thought about doors and wronged numbers and the strange grace of mistakes. He thought about how life could pivot on the smallest accidents, how a single misread digit could unravel decades of secrets, how opening the wrong door could lead you exactly where you needed to be. He thought about Mia and about the promise he'd made at her grave, and about how keeping that promise had given him not just purpose, but connection. community, a story of his own worth telling. And he thought about truth and how it could hurt more than lies in the moment, but eventually heal in ways deception never could. How sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone drowning is to not walk away, to stay present even when it's uncomfortable, to open doors, wrong or right, and see who needs help on the other side. 6 months later, on a brilliant autumn afternoon, the Thomas Kirby Memorial Foundation held its first scholarship ceremony at a community center on Chicago's South Side. 50 student children of incarcerated parents, young people working their way through school in service jobs, dreamers who'd been told to be realistic received full scholarships for the coming academic year. Evan sat in the audience next to Marcus Chun, watching as Laura and Catherine presented each award, spoke each student's name with reverence, honored each story of resilience and determination. And when Catherine stepped to the microphone for her closing remarks, her voice was steady and strong, no longer the voice of a woman trapped in a penthouse, but of someone who'd found her power in the wreckage. "My father was destroyed by a lie," Catherine said to the assembled students and families. "He spent 5 years in prison for crimes he didn't commit, and he died there, alone and disgraced. But he never lost hope that someday, somehow, the truth would matter, that his name would be cleared, that I would know he was a good man who tried to do the right thing." And he was right to hope, because eventually, even though it took decades, even though he didn't live to see it, the truth did come out. Justice did arrive, not in the timeline we wanted, but it came. She paused, looking out at the audience, at faces that showed every shade of Chicago's beautiful diversity, at people who knew intimately what it meant to be written off, to be invisible, to be told your circumstances defined your worth. "You are here today because someone opened a door," Catherine continued. Maybe it was the right door, or maybe her eyes found Evans in the crowd, and she smiled. Maybe it was the wrong door, but they walked through it anyway. They stayed when it would have been easier to leave. They chose to see you, to believe in you, to invest in your potential, and now you have the chance to do the same for others, to open doors, to stay present, to remember that sometimes the greatest thing we can do is refuse to walk away from someone who needs us, even when, especially when it costs us something. The ceremony ended with applause and tears, and the kind of hope that's forged in fire and loss, and the refusal to let circumstances have the final word. Afterward, as people mingled and students clutched their scholarship letters like lifelines to futures they'd barely dared imagine, Laura found Evan. "I have something for you," she said, handing him an envelope. Inside was a photograph, one Evan had never seen before. It showed the Drake Hotel on that February night, snow falling, the building lit up against the dark sky, and superimposed on the image, in elegant script, were the words, "Sometimes opening the wrong door leads you exactly where you need to be." "I had it made as a reminder," Laura said softly, "of what happened when you made a mistake and chose to stay anyway, of what became possible because you refused to walk away. Evan, you saved my life that night. Not in a dramatic physical sense, but in every way that really matters. You saw me at my lowest moment, and you chose to see me as human, as worth helping. Everything that came after, finding Catherine, exposing the truth, building the foundation, all of it started because you opened that door." Evan looked at the photograph, at the hotel that had been the setting for so much pain, and finally, hopefully, for healing. He thought about room 706, about a woman on the floor who'd needed someone to stay, about the choice he'd made in that moment to violate protocol and honor something deeper than rules. "It was room 706, Evan said, and even now the numbers felt significant, weighted with meaning. Not 607, the wrong room, "The right, wrong room," Laura corrected, and her smile held everything: gratitude, loss, and found family. The terrible and wonderful truth that sometimes the worst night of your life is also the beginning of something you never could have imagined. As the autumn light faded, and Chicago's evening lights began to sparkle across the skyline, Evan stood with Laura and Catherine and Marcus and 50 scholarship students, whose lives were now pivoting toward possibility. And he understood something fundamental about grace and second chances and the redemptive power of showing up, of staying, of opening doors, wrong or right, and refusing to walk away from whatever truth awaits on the other side. The Thomas Kirby Memorial Foundation went on to help thousands of students over the following years. The Drake Hotel's Second Chance program became a model that other luxury hotels adopted, creating pathways for service workers to pursue education without sacrificing survival. Joel Westfield served his sentence, and there were rumors he'd found religion or rehabilitation or at least regret in prison. Though none of the three who'd brought him down particularly cared, they'd moved forward. Built lives defined by what they'd chosen to create rather than what had been done to them. And sometimes, on quiet nights when Evan was studying at Northwestern, or years later when he was working with a teenager in crisis who needed someone to stay and not run from their pain, he would think about that February night, about the silver tray shaking in his hands, about the moment he'd pushed open the door to room 706 and found Laura Westfield on the floor, crying silent tears that spoke of devastation too large for sound. He would think about how close he'd come to just backing out, apologizing for the intrusion, leaving her there alone with her shattered marriage and her father's secrets and a sister she didn't know existed. How easy it would have been to choose policy over humanity, convenience over compassion, fear over love. And he would whisper a prayer of gratitude for wrong numbers and misread doors and the beautiful, terrible accidents that remind us we're all connected, that other people's crises are invitations to show up, that sometimes the greatest thing we can do is refuse to walk away, especially when walking away would be easier, safer, more reasonable. Because in the end, Evan had learned, we're all just looking for someone who will open the door wrong or right and stay, who will see us at our lowest and choose to believe we're worth the trouble of rescue, who will risk comfort and convenience and security to offer the simple, profound gift of presence. And if we're very lucky, if we're paying attention in the right moment, we get to be that person for someone else. We get to be the one who opens the door, who stays when others would flee, who bears witness to pain and possibility, and the stubborn human refusal to let darkness have the final word. Evan had opened the wrong door. It had been the most right thing he'd ever done. If this story moved you, if you've ever been lost and found by an unexpected act of kindness, please leave a comment sharing your own moment when someone opened the right wrong door for you. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that remind us we're never as alone as we think, that grace arrives in the most unexpected ways, and that sometimes the mistakes we make lead us exactly where we need to be. Thank you for listening, and remember, the next door you open, wrong or right, might change everything.